Incident Report by Moon claimed. It all started because Naruto had pen pals. But for convenience sake, let's start a little earlier. Naruto was the last living apprentice of Jiraiya of the Sannin, Konoha's most important spy master, and was therefore tacitly expected to take over for his mentor. But after the war, when Tsunade finally got around to asking what had become of the old pervert's spy network, Naruto's answer had been a blank stare. At further, and rather panicked, prompting, Naruto revealed that Jiraiya had not passed the network on to him. During their travels, while Jiraiya was off meeting with his contacts, he had left Naruto to wander the streets on his own. With some embarrassment, Naruto admitted he didn't know who any of Jiraiya's contacts were, and didn't have a single one of his own. No, Naruto had pen pals. Village intelligence was horrified to learn. All he had were some friends he had made in his travels who he tried to keep in contact with. People he had helped on his journey, people who had helped him. Hundreds of them, in fact. Across the globe and in all walks of life. From a fisherman in a little, out-of-the-way peasant village in tea country to merchants in stone, scullery maids in noble houses to daimyo's daughters. It took a shamefully long time, almost 3 months, for anyone to realize what this meant. When it finally occurred to Shikamaru that what any normal, well-functioning, sane shinobi would call a contact, Naruto might very well call a pen pal, he stopped where he was, turned on his heel, marched to the nearest wall, and began his earnest attempt to bash his head against it until he lost consciousness. The only reason he failed was because two Chunin and a very confused clerical nin were eventually able to pry him away. Once it was understood that Konoha's spy networks were as widespread as ever, though going by a decidedly friendlier name, the mass panic that had existed throughout the upper ranks began to calm. But not completely. After all, Naruto hadn't been in personal contact with many of these so-called pen pals for years. He hadn't made physical contact, hadn't done anything to maintain their loyalty long-term. So it was decided that he would go on another trip, as Jiraiya often had in the past, to check in. There was only one small problem with this. Naruto, newly promoted and village hero that he was, had just taken on his first Genin team the previous week. But then again, long-term training trips had never hurt anything, right? When is that boy going to report in? Hamura Mitokado demanded impatiently. His team was spotted approaching the gates almost an hour ago. Now, Mitokado-san, I'm sure he's just escorting his genin to their homes before coming. Kakashi soothed, glancing up from his book. After all, the gate guards would have told him to report directly to the Hokage's office. Tsunade grunted in affirmation. She was as excited as the next person that the brat was back, especially because retirement was starting to look better and Naruto kind of had to be in Konoha for her to do that. But Koharu and Hamura were going to be hanging around until this was over, and they refused to let her drink in her office. The sooner this report was over, the sooner she could get properly sloshed in celebration. There was a sudden scuffling from out in the hall. The 4 shinobi in the office turned to face the door just as Irika pushed through the entrance, red-faced with exertion and smiling gleefully. Hokage-sama, I just heard. Naruto was seen entering the village. I can't believe he's finally back after a whole year. And his genin are. He trailed off as he finally realized that not only were Tsunade and Kakashi in the office, both people he knew would be as excited as him to see the blonde again, but so were the 2 elderly village counselors. His smile slowly faded, replaced with a vivid blush. And never mind, I'll just come back later, he said as he edged backwards out of the room. Get in here, Irika, Tsunade sighed, leaning back in her chair. Naruto's about to come in, and we all know you're going to hear everything he tells us over ramen if you don't now. Irika stammered a little, flustered, but quickly subsided and took a place by Kakashi's side. He didn't want to see Naruto after all. I can't believe it's been a year already, Tsunade sighed as she leaned back in her chair. I want to see what the brat has done with those genin of his. I'm sure he's done a fine job, Irika cut in before he could stop himself. He knew it wasn't exactly his place, especially with the more traditional counselors in attendance, but he had full faith in the young blonde. Kakashi agreed. Naruto is sure to have taught the children well and to have had a successful trip. I smiled. After all, there have been no reports of mass destruction or war being declared on Konoha. Kakashi-sensei's mean. Came the protest from the window. As one, the shinobi turned. Hey, Naruto waved with a wide grin. There was a wave of reflexive smiles in return. Even Hamura and Koharu were glad to have the vibrant young man home, and the years seemed to have treated him well. Naruto had grown nearly 2 inches, his bangs hung long into his laughing eyes, and his skin was tanned and rosy as ever. "Welcome home, brat," Tsunade said with a fond smile. "Glad to see you haven't blown anything up." Naruto laughed and scratched the back of his head. "Haha, about that." Tsunade's smile froze. Kakashi lifted his hands in a calming gesture. Ma, I'm sure it wasn't that bad." "Yeah." Naruto jumped to agree. "Nothing actually blew up." "Well, nothing important," he amended. The others let out sighs of relief. These things were expected to happen during even lightest of shinobi training. So as long as it was nothing the village would have to pay for, no one really cared. "So what did you mean?" Koharu asked warily. Well, you know how me and Kurama are friends now," Naruto said a little nervously, glancing at the counselors out of the corners of his eyes. "Yeah, I know," Tsunade said with a roll of her eyes. Seriously, this kid would call a tree his friend if it stood still and listened to him talk, which was probably why he liked gardening so much, come to think of it. "So I let him out of the seal." There was a single, perfect moment when every adult in the room, men and women who had known Naruto in one manner or another since he was a tiny child, believed he was joking. It didn't last long. How? How could you do something so monumentally stupid, so uncompromisingly dangerous and reckless and treasonous, you stupid child? The blonde scowled. "I knew what I was doing. And it's not like I just let him out. There was kind of a situation, okay?" "Kind of a situation," Tsunade muttered to herself in horror. Releasing the seal, Naruto could have died from that alone, and she'd heard nothing, the brat. "Yep," Naruto agreed, finding himself a seat at the edge of the Hokage's desk. "But don't worry, I handled it." "Handled it by releasing an evil, 400-foot-tall, fox demon," Koharu raged. "Not exactly," an amused voice purred from the floor near the window. This time when the occupants of the room whipped around, it was a red-furred, chakra-infused, nightmare-inducing demon who greeted them. He was also 2.5 feet tall. With a canine laugh, the fox trotted to sit at Naruto's feet, all 9 of his tails waving happily behind him. "Oh," Naruto exclaimed into the horrified stillness of the room. "This is the first time I've gotten to introduce you, because he was always trapped in my stomach." He reached out and clapped the fox on his shoulder. "This is Kurama. Do not introduce us to that filthy beast." Hamura snarled. "At least you retained some small margin of sense and did not release it entirely. But even this is a reprehensible dereliction of your duty." The fox snarled, hackles raised and lips pulled back to expose vicious fangs. "Say that again," he hissed, growing rapidly in size even as his chakra gathered around him, killing intent so thick that... "Bad," Naruto reprimanded sharply. The squirt bottle he had summoned to his hand still held aloft after spraying a burst cold water in the Biju's face. Kurama yelped, then whined, rapidly shrinking even as his chakra dissipated. "Why the hell did you?" "Bad," the blonde sprayed again. "Don't do that," the mighty beast whimpered, hiding his muzzle between his paws. "Then don't make me, Kurama," Naruto said sternly, even as he returned the bottle to the storage seal on his wrist from which it had come. He held his stern expression for another few seconds before crumpling and scratching the still oversized fox between the ears. "Just don't do it again." "Yeah, whatever, that's the spot." The fox muttered happily, snuggling down to rest his head against Naruto's knee. The gathered shinobi could only stare blankly. Hamura shook his head. You treat the QB like a pet." "Hey," Naruto glared at the man. "I do not. This is just how I train people. And Kurama's got to learn when his behavior isn't acceptable." "Yes, like you would train a pet," Koharu suggested helpfully. "No way," the blonde dismissed, nose wrinkled in distaste. "I train my Genin team the exact same way." There was a single moment of frozen horror as that statement sunk in. "Naruto," Kakashi said as delicately as he could manage. "What, exactly, Do you mean by that? That's right, Naruto said, perking up. I haven't shown any of you my team since we got back. They're doing so well, you're all going to be so proud of them. And me? I taught them a whole lot. Why yes, I'm sure we will be. Tsunade gave a wooden smile and whispered out of the corner of her mouth to the nearest person, who happened to be Irika, "Hold my hand." The man gave her the look a startled rabbit gives a salivating wolf. Wah! I said hold it. No fool, Irika held her hand. Naruto graced them with a giddy grin before turning and leaning toward the open window. Duckies, he hollered for the whole village to hear. There was an awkward silence. When the seconds continued to tick by with only Naruto's cheerful humming to break the silence, and no Jinin miraculously appeared, the group began to shift uncomfortably. After an entirely silent conversation, communicated only in sharp gestures and a quick jab to the ribs, Kakashi stepped out of the huddle. So, he began, looking off-kilter even under his mask. He glanced back to the others for help, but Irika just made a shooing motion at him. So, he started again, turning back to Naruto. Why do you call them duckies? Oh, Naruto bounced slightly where he sat, grin widening into a full-on beam. It's because they always follow each other around in a line. And sometimes, don't tell them I told you or they'll get mad. They follow me around like that too. It's so cute. Don't tell them that. An annoyed voice demanded sulkily from the other side of the room. As one, the assembled shinobi whipped around to face the voice that had somehow managed to take a position at their backs. Duckies, Naruto greeted with a broad grin. He turned his attention back to the older group of shinobi and introduced, "Everybody, these are my duckies. Duckies, this is everybody." "Don't call us that." The tallest Genin, a boy with spiky brown hair and a thin scar that just missed his green eyes, complained. The girl, the one who had spoken before, buried her face in her hand so that her short lavender bangs fell forward. "If you have to keep calling us that, at least don't introduce us that way, Naruto-sensei." "The Hokage knows me as Ducky now," the shortest member of the team muttered to himself in horror. "I now have no future as a shinobi." The young blonde teacher rolled his eyes. "Come on, guys, it's not that bad." "Says you," came the discontented mutter from one of the children. Naruto ignored it. "Anyway," the proud Jounin-sensei continued, "if they're so unhappy with duckies, which I meant with love, by the way, then these are Koseda." The short boy waved shyly. Takashi, the taller boy, gave a two-finger salute. And Megumi. The girl smiled in the "what can you do?" way that all those closely acquainted with Naruto picked up eventually. Irika studied the children with interest. They hadn't been in any of his classes at the academy, so he really didn't know too much about them besides the most general information. Takashi was from a civilian family, Koseda and Megumi from very minor clans. All three had been known to be middle-of-the-road students with high potential, but they have impressive stealth. More than impressive, really, for Genin to sneak up on the caliber of shinobi gathered in the office. "Yes," Kakashi agreed, once more behind his book. "How did you manage to drill that into them so young?" "That one was easy," the blonde said, standing and propping a hand on his hip. "So I realized something recently. I used to wear bright orange." Awkward silence number 2 ensued, with only the sound of Tsunade face-palming to interrupt. Naruto laughed awkwardly, before clearing his throat. "I mean, I used to wear bright orange and regularly escaped from A and BU as a kid." "That is impressive," Irika began, "but I don't see how. I made them all wear orange jumpsuits until I was satisfied with their skills," Naruto proclaimed proudly. There was a collective shudder from the Genin. "Do you know how badly orange clashes with lavender hair?" Megumi demanded with haunted eyes. "Do you?" "It was awful," Takashi agreed. Megumi elbowed him. Irika hummed contemplatively. "An unusual approach, but apparently effective. Maybe we can implement it in the general student body." "No," Tsunade cut off. Irika started, "But the results." "No." Tsunade slanted the man a look that had him shutting his mouth and instinctively sliding behind Kakashi for protection. "I knew you were my favorite Hokage for a reason," Megumi said reverently. The male counselor shook his head. "That's all very well, but you are missing the point. To have our ninja so degraded. I'm not degrading them, Naruto protested, looking truly upset. I only do it because it works. Besides, they don't mind. He turned to look at the kids, hefting the quickly retrieved squirt bottle into the air as a visual aid. Do you? But at the quick motion of the spray bottle, the three took an instinctive step backwards. Koseido whimpered a little. Naruto blinked, then looked from the bottle in his hand to the three genin. Running his free hand through his hair, he asked, "Would you really rather be punished with something else? Like, a timeout would work, right?" Squirt bottle. Takashi blurted immediately before scurrying to his teacher's side. Squirt bottle. Megumi agreed quickly before joining the boy. Koseido hesitated, eyeing the hated spray bottle fearfully. Naruto crossed his arms, considering. If you'd really rather, Koseido, I could. Squirt bottle. The boy squeaked before hurrying to hide behind his taller teammates. Well, there you have it, Naruto said, satisfied, as he turned back to the group. They're all happy with it, and it works. The point is, you shouldn't be punishing them at all for minor infractions, Tsunade graded out. Why? Naruto asked with real surprise. Children need boundaries, right? That's what Irika-sensei always used to say, and he's the best teacher ever. Tsunade turned a vitriol glare on the school teacher. Irika glanced around at his superiors, all giving him dirty looks, and sighed. And I'm out of that job, he muttered under his breath. What was that? The blonde asked innocently. Nothing, the man sighed. Okay, Naruto said slowly, before continuing. Besides, it's not like I always punish them. I reward them when they're good, and a lot of the time I don't even need to because I find ways to motivate them. Out of morbid curiosity more than anything else, Kakashi asked, and how exactly did you do that? Here Naruto paused. I found ways. Flashback. But Naruto-sensei, Koseido whined as he sat at the bottom of a great tree. You don't have great chakra control, and you're a really strong shinobi. Yeah, why do we have to do something this tedious when we won't even need it? Takashi demanded. I have enough control to tree climb, the teacher pointed out to his slacking students. The three, each at the base of their own tree, glared up at him sullenly. Or, Naruto scratched the back of his head in thought. Well, I guess in general I get past having lousy control by having huge reserves. And I have that because I'm a Jinchuriki. Here he paused contemplatively. I've never really known of anyone who wanted to become one before, but I do know the seal, and I'm sure we could find a few minor demons around here somewhere, he said while absently reaching for his best sealing brush. There was a beat of silence, and then the kids ran for their trees. In flashback. Kakashi opened his mouth to ask, but Tsunade cut him off. Don't, Kakashi. I don't think I could take it just now. The Jounin shrugged and let it drop. It was probably for the best. Koseido frowned, glancing from his sensei to the adults in the room. Why are you insulting Naruto-sensei like that? He demanded. He's a great teacher. He looks out for us. He trained us really well, and we're way stronger than I thought we would be this soon after graduating. Naruto blinked, then turned to grin widely at the boy. My students are so awesome, he gushed, reaching out and pat the boy on the head. Thanks for defending me, Ducky. And with a little sleight of hand, he pulled his hand away and pulled a chocolate out from behind the genin's ear. Yes, Koseido cheered, grabbing the treat, popping it in his mouth, and settling back to bask in his teammates' jealous glares. Where did I go wrong? Irika said faintly as he watched the scene with morbid fascination. Maybe it was the whole treating him to ramen when he did well thing? Kakashi guessed. All right, that is it, Tsunade announced suddenly, determination glinting in her eyes. Let's just not tell anyone about this. If none of this craziness goes further than this room, then we won't have any problems. She spun on the blonde teenager, pointing a finger under his chin. Naruto, she jabbed him in the sternum. Stop petting your genin. Naruto retracted his hand reluctantly with a wounded expression. The three genin glared. They liked when sensei pet them and gave them treats. And for goodness sakes, the Hokage snapped. Put the Kyuubi back in the... Here she trailed off as she finally realized that the large, talking, demon fox was nowhere in sight. Naruto, she said slowly, where did the Kyuubi go? Naruto's face screwed up in confusion. He went to go stretch his legs while we were waiting for the duckies. You didn't notice? Awkward silence number 3. Hamura made an abortive step forward. Where did it G? Ah! The blood-curdling shriek went up from the village proper, soon joined by the cries of many others. Damn it, not again, Naruto muttered before jumping onto the windowsill, trusty squirt bottle already in hand. Hang on for just a second, Bachan. I got this. And he was gone. I need Sake to deal with this. Everyone blinked. Kakashi looked to the man at his side. I didn't know you drank, Irika. The teacher pinched the bridge of his nose to try and stop the pounding in his head. I do now. Naruto sighed as he finally collapsed into his favorite stool in front of Ichiraku's. He had had a long day. First, he had to make the long trek with the duckies into the village. Then he had that meeting in Tsunade Bachan's office. And then Naruto had been forced to chase Kurama down and make him spit out the civilian man he had been, gently gnawing on. Naruto was almost sure the fox was telling the truth and the man deserved it. Kurama was usually good like that. Still, Kurama was a lot stronger than the man, and once the guy had wet himself it was really just overkill. So the fox had still earned himself a squirt to the face. Kurama was currently grumbling from the seat next to him, body shrunken down to barely the size of a puppy and curled into a discontented ball of fluff. He stared up at Naruto out of one irritated eye. Must you always eat ramen? I want inarizushi. But Ichiraku's is the best food on earth, the blonde protested, without turning away from his eager study of Tuchi's back as his first serving was prepared. At least get udon, the fox growled, all 9 tails flicking with ire. Naruto made a disgusted face. Truthfully, udon wasn't too bad, but it was so close to ramen and yet not that it was more of a tease than a meal. Tuchi, the kind and wise man that he was, looked back over his shoulder at the red ball of fur. How about I put in extra pork, just for you? The QB considered that, then turned back to Naruto. I understand why you wish for this one to live. That means thanks, Naruto translated absently, hands white-knuckled on the tabletop in anticipation. After a year with no quality ramen, he couldn't focus on anything else. Even if he had already spent over an hour here earlier in the day when he was supposed to be going to that meeting with Tsunade, Kakashi, and the elders. Totally worth it. For his part, Tuchi just shrugged and got back to cooking. Most chefs would be upset at having a murderous bijou sitting at their stand, but Tuchi was different. He knew that anyone that was exposed to Naruto long enough was doomed to his way of thinking. And the fox had been the boy's constant companion for 18 years. The QB hadn't had any choice but to be reformed. It was also a comfort to know that Naruto was willing to fight to the death to protect his favorite source of ramen. And he bet the fox knew it too. Order up, the older man called cheerfully before placing 2 steaming bowls of miso ramen, extra pork for both, on the house, in front of his favorite costumer and the blonde's friend. Naruto grinned, grabbing his chopsticks and clapping his hands together with a brief "itadakamasu" before digging in. But he paused with his chopsticks hovering over his bowl. He had been too frenzied on his first stop at the ramen stand to think of it, but sitting here now, it reminded him of when he had first met his duckies. Flashback. Today was a very important day in the lives of his young students. As such, Irika tried to keep his speech as original and individually directed to his students' personalities as he could each year. Beginning today, you are all real ninja. But you're at the bottom of the barrel, merely rookie genin. I will now assign your 3-man teams, and after lunch your Jounin sensei will come to collect you. That was as far as he got before there was a poof of smoke, and he was tackled from the side. It was only years-long experience that allowed the man to keep his feet under the unexpected assault. Naruto, he protested, smacking the teenager on the back of the head. What do you think you're doing? The blonde popped back up with a wide grin splitting his face. I'm here to get my genin team. He laughed delightedly. Can you believe I'm going to be a sensei? Not really, no. Irika muttered to himself grumpily before sighing and giving a small smile. I'm sure you'll do a fine job, but I haven't even started giving out the team assignments yet. Wait a minute, a young voice yelled from the sea of students. Naruto and Irika turned to face the prospective genin and then flinched in surprise at the manic grins on many of the young faces. Are you telling me that Uzumaki Naruto is taking a genin team this rotation? The same child, a tall boy with brown hair and bright green eyes, demanded. Naruto scratched the back of his head, suddenly nervous. Yeah, I am. The room exploded with noise. Awesome. Hell yeah. I'm totally gonna be on his team. Quiet. Irika snapped, vein pulsing in his temple. The noise continued. Irika blinked in surprise. That was the first time in memory that Irika's sensei of death no jutsu failed to have its intended effect. Hee. Naruto laughed by his side. It made him kind of uncomfortable when the older citizens of Konoha made a big deal over him. But he was more than happy to be the kid's hero. Looking back and forth between the blonde's rakish grin and the children's loud chatter, Irika sighed. There wouldn't be a moment of peace until Naruto left, and he was far too hard-headed to be convinced to leave without his team in tow. Listen up, Irika called to little effect. He cleared his throat, lifted his clipboard, and read aloud. Team 7. Dead silence. The teacher rolled his eyes heavenward before continuing on. Consists of Kamaya Takashi, Sagara Megumi, and Himura Koseda. Come to the front and join your new sensei. The silence held for a half-second more before erupting into shouts, cries of outrage, and 3 delighted squeals. The named graduates darted from their seats to line up in front of Naruto. Koseda, the slowest and most nervous of the bunch, got there a moment late and wasn't able to stop on a dime, knocking into Takashi, who almost sent Megumi sprawling. Hi. Naruto greeted with a manic grin as the children picked themselves back up and brushed themselves off. Without giving them the chance to respond, the blonde yelled, "Meet me on the roof," gave a thumbs up, and disappeared in another poof of smoke. Irika sighed. Don't mind him. He's been going a little nuts with the poofing since he learned the Shunshin last week. He waved them towards the door. Get going, kids. And good luck. By the time the kids had made it up to the roof, Naruto had already been sitting there for some minutes. Unfortunately, it was enough time for nervousness to kick in. Truthfully, Naruto had known he wasn't supposed to enter Irika's class yet, but he had thought he could rush right past his nerves. And it had worked at first, but they were starting to catch back up with him. What if he couldn't do this? Those kids had been so excited. What if he let them down? Fighting was completely different than having little people depend on him like this. We're here, the tall boy declared as the 3 pre-genin burst through the door and onto the roof. What the hell? He'd do his best, and he could always ask Sakura, Kakashi, Irika, or Bachan for advice as he went. It's not like he'd be totally isolated without any support while he trained the kids. Grin stealing over his face as he watched the kids squirm excitedly in front of him, Naruto decided he wouldn't be remiss to copy his own sensei. Papa squat, kids, and then introduce yourselves. Koseda plopped down where he was, face eager if slightly intimidated. My name's Koseda. I'm Megumi, the girl called brightly, crouching down on her haunches. Takashi, the tallest kid, sat himself down. Naruto scratched the back of his head. Maybe Sakura had been right to ask for clarification. I wanted a little more than that. Like, here, let me go first. He leaned towards them excitedly. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. My hobbies are pulling pranks, gardening, and eating ramen. I like ramen and training. I dislike the 3 minutes it takes for instant ramen to cook and… Naruto cocked his head in thought. War? Yeah, I don't like that much. I'm going to be the Rokudame Hokage, unless Bachan finds out who really hid her sake. And my dream is to protect Konoha and all my precious people. A shiver of what could only be described as hero worship went up each child's spine. Their sensei was so cool. Let me go first, Megumi said, nearly bouncing in excitement. My name is Sagara Megumi. My hobby is studying poisons. I like books and practicing throwing Senbon, and I dislike when my brother goes away on long missions. My dream is to become a great kunoichi and make it into ANBU. Good for you, purple girl, Naruto said before pointing at the short kid. Koseda stared at Naruto's finger like one of the Nara deer did a speeding fireball. Takashi sighed and whapped him on the back of the head. The boy jumped and started. All right. My name is Himura Koseda. My hobbies are training and cooking. And… You cook? Naruto interrupted in surprise. The boy blushed, ears turning pink, and ducked his head. Why yeah, my mom and sisters are all jounin and they're really busy, so Hey, it's not a bad thing, the blonde assured. It's awesome. Now when we go on assignments, we won't have to eat what I make. He stuck out his tongue. All I can cook is instant ramen, and Tsunade Bachan made an official proclamation that I couldn't eat it on missions after never mind. Oh, the boy stuttered, confused but trying not to show it. I like curry and going on walks, and I don't like when my sisters tease me. My dream is to make my family proud of me. Naruto nodded at the boy in acknowledgement before looking over at the only kid left. The green-eyed boy took that as his cue. I'm Kamaya Takashi. I like people who are straightforward, and I dislike mind games. He blinked. Does picking fights with tough-looking opponents count as a hobby? You're a shinobi now, Naruto said seriously. Of course it does. Awesome, Takashi grinned. My dream is to prove that civilian-born ninja can make it as heavy combat shinobi. Wow, Naruto said to himself. I have a really cool team. I hope you guys pass. The three blinked and looked at each other. Naruto-sensei? Megumi said with a raised hand. We already passed. No, you passed the academy test, he corrected before breaking out in an evil grin. Now you have to pass my test, or you get sent straight back to the academy. And no one has ever passed before. He neglected to mention this was because he had never actually given a genin test before. He figured it would spoil the mood. By the horrified looks on their faces, he had made the right call. I'm supposed to give it to you guys tomorrow, but the day's still young, right? For some reason, the three preteens got a very bad feeling. We're having the test here? Megumi asked in disbelief. Why? Naruto asked, blinking. What's wrong with it? The kids' faces screwed up in confusion. Should they really have to explain this? It's a ramen stand, sensei. Takashi explained slowly. It is not. The jounin snapped with sudden anger. It's the best ramen stand on the face of the earth. Now apologize to Tucci-san. The hero worship was starting to wear a little thin. Megumi looked around to see if it was a joke, but when she couldn't find any hidden cameras, she muttered, Sorry, sir. Koseda bowed at her side. Sorry. Takashi shrugged and muttered his own apology. For his part, the ramen stand owner just laughed and went back to cooking. If those poor kids passed, they were in for a hell of a time. Now sit down so we can get started, Naruto said as he claimed his own seat on one of the middle stools. The pre-genin hesitated for only a few seconds before settling down on either side of their sensei. How is this going to work, Naruto-sensei? Koseda asked, looking around the stand curiously. He couldn't see any hidden traps or anything, and the owner moved like a civilian, not a shinobi undercover, or even one who had retired. So how could this make a test? Right, the blonde said, clapping his hands together once. Because I'm a really nice guy, there are going to be 2 ways to pass this test. Megumi scowled and crossed her arms in front of her chest. If there were 2 ways to pass and still no one had ever done it, that wasn't looking good. The first way, Naruto continued with one finger held up, is to beat me in a ramen eating contest. There was a collective moment of disbelief from the genin. What? Takashi demanded. How the hell does that have anything to do with being a shinobi? Naruto rolled his eyes. Shinobi face all kinds of weird challenges that they have to overcome to accomplish their mission objectives. And because it's totally a way for me to get as much ramen as I can eat for free. He grinned. Did you know Jounin Sensei are reimbursed for any materials used directly in genin training? Best rule ever. The hero worship? Yeah, that was gone. So the 3 of us have to eat more ramen than you do? No, Naruto corrected. Each one of you individually have to eat more than I do. And I can finish 20 bowls without even trying. So you better work hard. Megumi turned slightly green at the very thought of trying to force that much food down. What's the second way? She asked uneasily. Glad you asked, the teacher said with a grin before reaching into his pocket and fishing out a delicate pair of silver bells. The kids stared for a minute. This was getting weirder and weirder. What are we supposed to do with those? Takashi asked, leaning forward and narrowing his eyes to peer at them. Steal them from me, Naruto said. While we're having an eating contest? The boy asked with confusion. Yup, I'm going to hang them right up here, the blonde said, pointing to a wire that had been strung along the front of the ramen stand about a foot about head height, so that it hung from two pulleys at either end. Naruto reached up and hung the bells on the wire, so that one dangled off in either direction like a pair of cherries. Then he yanked on the cord, and it moved easily along the pulley's track. See, it works like this. The bells will be over my head when we start our contest. If you can get a bell, you pass. If you eat more ramen than me, you win. If your butt leaves the seat, you lose. If you damage the stand in any way, you die. But then how am I supposed to kick your ass? Takashi demanded in outrage. Naruto grinned cheekily. You wouldn't be able to do that anyway. The real question, Koseda murmured worriedly, is why are there only 2 bells? Naruto blinked and then glanced back at the pair of dangling bells. Well, would you look at that? There are only 2. He tapped his chin in thought. Guess only 2 of you can pass that way. I hope one of you really likes ramen. But you already said it was basically impossible for us to beat you that way, Megumi protested. It's okay, Naruto assured. You all don't have to pass. Really? Koseda asked hopefully. You mean if only one of us passes then the rest of us will be sent straight back to the academy? Yes. The Jounin said with a sage nod. What? Megumi and Takashi cried in outrage. But Koseda stayed quiet, head bent and discouraged tears beating at the corners of his eyes, before whispering just loud enough to be heard. So there's really no way to pass? You were tricking us into thinking we could be your team. Naruto crossed his arms over his chest and scowled at them. You're really going to give up that easy? You guys obviously think you're pretty weak if you're not even going to try. Yeah, right, Megumi yelled, shaking her fist. I'll beat your stupid test, and then you'll feel like an idiot. Yeah, Takashi agreed. We can do it. You're going to have to eat your words. There was silence for a long second before Koseda sniffled and wiped his eyes. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm not going to give up. He lifted his face to show anger and determination burning in his eyes. We're going to beat your test. You'll see. Naruto tried to remain the cool and uncaring sensei he was supposed to be for this test. Really, he did. It kind of failed when he broke out in the biggest grin yet. Nearly an hour later, and Megumi was ready to hurl. She had eaten 6 whole bowls of ramen. She thought her stomach was going to blow, and she was still 14 bowls behind Naruto-sensei. Even Takashi, who was by far in the lead of the genin, was 9 bowls behind. Fighting down nausea, she slurped up another noodle. Would throwing up disqualify her? He hadn't actually said it would. And getting the bells seemed to be an even more lost cause than winning the eating contest. Anytime one of them so much as reached in the direction of the cord the bells were hanging off of, something, kunai, shuriken, a napkin dispenser, would come flying at them. And considering they weren't allowed to leave their seats, dodging became an issue. So basically they had already lost. Unless Naruto-sensei felt like being nice and choked on a pork bone, they were about to lose their chance at making it into the shinobi ranks. Megumi bit the inside of her lip, trying to bite back a sniffle. She couldn't even use her weapons because Naruto-sensei was sure to dodge, and then she would damage the stand, which was one of the main disqualifying rules, and she just really didn't want to test the Jounin on the death rule. He seemed a little unstable when it came to ramen. Taijutsu wouldn't work either, not without them being allowed to get up from the stools. Not unless kicking him in the shins was going to do anything. By her side, Takashi seemed to have realized the same thing. With a groan, his head smacked into bar by his half-empty bowl. What the hell are we supposed to do? He asked morosely. We have to try something. The girl snarled with stubborn determination. Nissan was so proud that I passed. I'm not letting him down now. Yeah, the brown-haired boy muttered. But what are we going to do? There was a thunk as Koseda let his ramen bowl drop from suddenly lax fingers. Eyes wide, he turned to face his teammates past Naruto's back. I have an idea, he said slowly, barely believing his own words. His teammates perked up and looked over at him, but they didn't really have much hope. This test was impossible. I have an idea, the short boy said again louder. I have an idea. Naruto finally looked up over the rim of his 20-second bowl of ramen to glance at the kid. What's that, squirt? Koseda whipped around to face his sensei, leaning forward eagerly. Naruto-sensei, what's your favorite type of ramen? Naruto blinked and absently slurped a noodle. Well, he said slowly, figuring he might as well play along and more than willing to discuss his ramen preferences. My favorite has always been miso with extra pork. Really? Koseda asked with big, excited eyes. That's awesome. He turned to his teammates. Isn't that awesome, guys? Megumi and Takashi glanced at each other. The poor boy had cracked under the stress. Sure. Mister, Koseda said, the same excitement in his voice as he called to Itachi. Can you make me a bowl of Naruto-sensei's favorite? I want to try it. Sure. The man said with a shrug and got back to cooking. He had been on standby through the test so far, replacing bowls of ramen as fast as the shinobi could eat them. It was a lot more work than he had on a normal day, but then again he was making more money than he usually saw in a week. He'd just add this to the tab. Naruto frowned. Why hadn't he thought of asking for his favorite? Probably because he always got an extra large, and that meant he would eat less bowls. Planning the test, he had been sure he could out-eat these kids, but he never knew. One of them could have been half a kimchi or something. He had thought it was better not to risk it. But if the short kid was going for it anyway. Hey, Naruto-sensei, Koseda said, breaking Naruto from his thoughts and calling his attention back to his potential students. The boy was smiling manically, eyes gleaming with a crazed light. Isn't ramen great? Yeah. The blonde jounin said uneasily. Maybe he had pushed the boy too far. But I mean, isn't it like really, really great? Naruto blinked and considered. Yeah, ramen was really superbly excellent, wasn't it? The blonde nodded decisively. Forget crazy, this kid got it. That's the kind of student he wouldn't mind having. But wait a minute. Naruto frowned. Koseda hadn't seemed too enthusiastic about ramen before his little idea. Was he trying to brown-nose his way into passing? Naruto didn't really like the sound of that. Yep. The shortest member of the team continued with the same wild grin on his face. Ramen is the food of champions. Wasting it would be a crime. I totally agree, Naruto said carefully. But what are you? Order up. Itachi cut in as he placed the large, steaming bowl of miso pork goodness in front of the boy. If possible, the kid's grin stretched wider. He reached out and snagged the bowl in both hands. It looks good, doesn't it? The boy leaned and sniffed loudly. Smells great too. Naruto stared at the bowl of ramen in Koseda's hands. It did look really good, and even though he was surrounded by ramen, he could swear the smell wafting from the bowl was extra strong. Megumi, always quick on the uptake, held the subtle genjutsu as best she could. But what were they going to do now? The jutsu might hold while they were all perfectly still, but she was nowhere near good enough to keep the blonde distracted if they moved and attracted attention to themselves. As if to reinforce this point, the blonde jounin took that moment to reach back and whack at Takashi's reaching fingers. The boy yelped and retracted his hand from the bells. Speaking with his eyes, Koseda looked at his teammates and then to the bells. When they stared blankly, he rolled his eyes and repeated the motion again. What? Megumi demanded in a whisper. Why exactly would that work now when it didn't this whole time? Because this, Koseda said loudly before tossing the ramen, bowl and all, into the street. Naruto, jounin that he was, realized what the boy was about to do a split second before he moved. Thankfully, he was able to lunge after it and snag it out of the air without spilling even one precious drop. Once assured the ramen was safe and sound in his arms, he turned with murder in his eyes to face the pre-genin. What the hell was that about? He asked angrily. It was only then he noticed the kids each had a smirk on their face. What? As one, Megumi and Takashi held up a bell. He blinked. Oh, right. He was supposed to be guarding the bells, not the ramen. He frowned and propped the hand, not cradling the bowl of ramen to his chest on his hip. So Megumi and Takashi passed then. He frowned. Too bad, Koseda. I'm sure we'll miss you. The grins grew wider. Naruto cocked his head to the side. Naruto-sensei, Koseda said, you're not in your seat. Huh? The teacher said after a long moment of silence as he mentally reviewed the rules. Would you look at that? The short boy flinched as the jounin disappeared from in front of him and reappeared an inch from his side a split second later, face set in a fierce scowl. Sorry, the boy squeaked. I didn't really think about throwing it. I just meant to distract you. But then I thought it might work, so I... Takashi grabbed his shortest teammate by the shoulders and dragged him back towards his chest protectively. "Hey, Naruto-sensei," Megumi said with forced cheer as she moved to put herself even with her teammates. "So we passed, right? So we can go home, and will Jay just see you tomorrow?" Naruto stared the three preteens down until they were quivering. Then, the corner of his lip twitched. Then again. Then the smile broke over his face, and he reached out with a laugh and mussed all of their hair in turn. "Yup, you pass with flying colors." "Really?" The kids all but squealed, eyes bright and eager. "Yup," Naruto said with a closed-eye grin before his frown slammed back into place and his eyes opened to reveal burning embers glaring out. "But we're going to have a little talk about threatening ramen." Naruto had barely started on his fourth serving when Kurama's ears perked up. The fox blinked lazily and looked up from his bowl of extra pork goodness to peer in the direction his ears had turned, before darting away and down the street. Naruto had just enough time to notice Kurama's absence and frowned thoughtfully before disaster struck. Or Sakura's fist did, rather. Naruto noticed a blur of pink movement out of the corner of his eye at the last moment and threw himself to the side, but the girl's fist still clipped his shoulder. It was enough to send him flying across the street and through the old fence that had loyally stood there for years. Had the gate been sentient, it would have told you that it had been erected before the first Hokage had been elected, before Konoha was Konoha, and was still just a loose conglomeration of ninja clans living in ramshackle tents with dreams of a village. It had survived war, invasion, and even Pain's nearly complete destruction of the village 2 years before. It was modest enough to admit that it had had poles replaced and hinges fixed, but in its heart it was that same loyal fence from generations past. Of course, it wasn't sentient, so that was all moot. Besides, rubble was a good new look for it, really. "Ow," the blonde, who was at least arguably sentient, moaned as he lay in the pile of wreckage. "Hello, Naruto. I didn't expect to see you here," Sakura said with a sweet smile and murder in her eyes. Her red-rimmed, bloodshot eyes surrounded by disheveled pink hair. "After all, you didn't come tell me you were back." Naruto laughed nervously. "About that." Sakura's smile turned just a touch sweeter. "You're my favorite person." Naruto squealed in a desperate attempt to save himself, scuttling backwards through the rubble of his landing. The girl paused and then tossed her hair over her shoulder with a sigh. "Calm down. It's not like I'm going to hurt you." "Yeah, 'cause you didn't do that already," the blonde muttered. The girl twitched. "What was that?" "Nothing. I mean..." "Ah, Sakura-san," Itachi greeted warmly, completely dismissing the duo's antics. However long Naruto's absence, he was still used to Team 7. "You're regular?" "You're a lifesaver, Itachi-san," the pink-haired girl sighed, turning her back on her downed teammate to give the man a grateful smile. "Sakura-chan," Naruto said with delight, jumping up from his pile of rubble without seeming to notice he should have at least 3 fractured ribs and a concussion. "You have a regular at Ichiraku's now." That was just about the best news Naruto had ever heard. He had almost given up teaching Sakura the wonder that was ramen before he left. She turned back towards him before yawning. "Yeah, I kinda needed to. Between my duties as one of the head medics at the hospital, my missions as a jounin, and my Jinin team, I need all the energy I could get." Naruto squinted his eyes in confusion for a second, but then nodded along happily. After all, ramen was a wonderful source of energy. He ate at Ichiraku at least once a day when he was able to, and he was known as the most hyperactive ninja alive. Where did people think he got all that energy? "Here you go," Itachi said as he placed a foam cup on the counter. Sakura smiled and exchanged her money for the beverage with evident relief. "Thanks." Naruto, meanwhile, was having something of an existential crisis. Is that coffee, Sakura-chan?" "What?" the medic asked after taking a long pull. She cocked her head to the side and then rolled her eyes. "Duh, I said I needed energy." "But where's your ramen?" "I'm not getting any." The expression on Naruto's face at that moment could only be described as disgusted horror. "I don't even know you anymore, Sakura-chan." Sakura's face snapped into a scowl. "Don't make me punch you again." Sensei is so embarrassing when she's like this. A girl's voice complained weakly from behind them. "Are you kidding?" came the delighted response. Sensei's awesome when she's kicking ass. The third teammate, a tall boy with a long, narrow face and distinctive eyes, only grunted. But his feelings were clear enough from the smirk on his face. Naruto stopped cowering long enough to glance back and blink at the three Genin, two Inuzuka and a Hyuga if the facial markings and eyes were anything to go by, who were lurking at the edge of the stand. The blonde turned back to face his teammate and asked, "When did you get a Genin team? You didn't even listen when I told you I had them, did you?" Correctly interpreting Naruto's silence as a yes, the medic propped her hand on her hip and rolled her eyes. 6 months after you did, she answered. They're great kids, but truthfully, I just don't have time to train them. Usually being a leading medic in the hospital is a full-time job in and of itself, and I was already pulling Jounin missions on top of that. I'm sure I'm sleep-deprived, and I'm afraid I take it out on them sometimes. Naruto turned to glance at the kids, who shrugged in response. The girl, one of the two Inuzuka, answered, "It's not that bad. I mean, it was kind of scary at first when Sakura-sensei threw boulders at us, but at least it's a good workout. And avoiding sensei's punches adds a lot of motivation to agility training." Naruto's jaw dropped in horror. He was okay when Sakura decked him, but Genin? Normal Genin? How were they all still standing and seemingly unmaimed? "Hey, I do the best I can," Sakura said defensively in response to his expression. "They're all improving well for the amount of time I can give them, and they work hard on their own. Besides," she muttered, "I wasn't even supposed to have them in the first place." "What?" Naruto blinked. "What does that mean?" "Well," flashback. Team 7 had something of an odd relationship, most likely because of their exceedingly odd history. Not because of Sasuke's defection, sad as it was all too common for a team member to defect and become an enemy. No, Team 7 was odd because Sasuke came back. Tranquilized like a prized, pet jungle cat, yes. But he still came back. Not that he really had much of a choice. After the injury, he couldn't live on his own at first, and his options had been limited. Jugo had died in battle. Suigetsu could barely care for himself, let alone someone as high maintenance as Sasuke, and Karen. Well, Naruto got to Karen. And then they found out she was, shudder, related to the Dobe, and all hope for her was lost. The two had spent a week after the big reveal nearly attached at the hip and, the horror, bonding. And no, Sasuke wasn't jealous that Naruto had family after all. Or that Karen did. Okay, so maybe normally he would be, just a little. But in this case the people in question found out they were related to either Naruto or Karen. As far as Sasuke was concerned, that was dodging a kunai. But what was Sasuke supposed to do? After he learned the truth, not what Konoha had done, but that Tobi was the reason Itachi had been unable to refuse, Sasuke wasn't about to let the bastard win. And if he had to team up with Naruto again and see his ecstatic smile and hear him blather on about how they were a team again and he had never lost faith in Sasuke, well, so be it. Then, of course, Tobi had ripped his eyes out of their sockets. That had kind of put a damper on things. But in the great tradition of their team line's history, the Dobe donated an eye to the bastard genius with the Kunoichi medic Nin to assist. Naruto hadn't been dying and was a Jinchuriki and an Uzumaki to boot, so his eye had grown back within 2 hours, but it totally still counted. Yeah, sometimes Sasuke worried about his team. And sometimes, when Sasuke's newly feebled grasp of depth perception had led him to walk into yet another wall, he was tempted to ask Naruto for another eye. Seriously, Naruto was like a free organ factory when you thought about it. But Sasuke knew that Naruto would agree without hesitation, which, against all logic, made him feel too guilty to ask. Plus, Sakura might have discreetly threatened to strangle him with his own entrails if he did. That may have influenced his decision slightly. Hard to say. Besides, being one-eyed made Sasuke seem more like Kakashi than Orochimaru to the general population, which was decidedly in his favor if he planned to survive in Konoha. And then there was the fact that, knowing the Dobe, Naruto would insist on giving Sasuke his left eye. Again. And then Sasuke would be forced to spend the rest of his life with 2 left eyes. Sasuke was far too obsessive-compulsive to handle that, so he quietly let that dream die. He had enough in his life to irate him. He didn't have to add to the problem. Like Tsunade. How he hated Tsunade and all of her kind. Tsunade, for her part, was using much more effort than should have been necessary to keep from growling, or lunging forward and biting the last Uchiha's head right off his scrawny neck. What do you mean you failed the Genin team you were assigned? Sasuke huffed and crossed his arms in front of his chest. That should be pretty obvious. It means I failed them. I sent them back to the academy. I'm not taking the little monsters. It really wasn't worth the effort not to clobber him, the Godame thought. It really wasn't. I got that part. What I don't understand is how you can justify that when you just told me that they figured out the objective of the test and worked together. The Uchiha shrugged. Tsunade gritted her teeth and tried to refrain from strangling the brat, for Sakura and Naruto's sakes. The dark-haired Nin gave a long, suffering sigh. We both know you only gave me that Genin team so they could serve as spies and report my activities back to you. There's no way you'd actually trust me with a team. Stop being paranoid, Uchiha, Tsunade snorted aloud. Internally, her thoughts were closer to, damn, he's onto us. All the same, I won't be taking on your little brats. I might have given up burning this place to the ground, but I'm not exactly thrilled to be giving you my techniques either. He didn't mention that without his Sharingan, he couldn't perform most of them anyway. Tsunade gritted her teeth. She had been convinced that this plan would work out. If it didn't, it was one more thing she would have to deal with, and she now had 3 clan children she would have to place suddenly on top of it. Fed up, she shot a glower at the oblivious teen and shouted, Sakura, come here and clean up after your teammate. What did Sai do now? The pink-haired medic called, voice exhausted, from the file room in the back of the office. Besides paint 6 foot tall, male genitalia on public monuments again, nothing. Then Kakashi? He was 3 hours late to a meeting with the daimyo and almost got Konoha's funding cut, but wrong one. Yamato. Sakura sounded incredulous. But he's normally so good. He spent the last 3 days trying to teach the forest to waltz again and ended up in the hospital when he got trampled and made more work for me. But besides that, he's good. Oh, come on. Naruto's not even in the country. It was Sasuke Sakura. There was a long minute of silence. Isn't he still in prison? Tsunade paused as her and the last Uchiha single I met for a second. Sasuke had been out of confinement for almost 3 months. You had tea with him last week, the Hokage reminded. I've had tea. At that moment, eyes still locked in a standoff, Tsunade and Sasuke's thoughts might have been described as inverse reflections of each other. Sasuke's thoughts were something like this. Everyone knew that the pink-haired girl was working herself to the bone to hold the hospital together on top of taking missions. There was no way that Tsunade would actually give her any more work. Not only was it inefficient and cruel, this was Sakura they were talking about, Tsunade's apprentice. That meant the woman knew her well enough to know that if the pressure kept up, Sakura would snap like a twig and make Itachi's slaughter of the Uchiha clan look like a faux pas on par with using the wrong silverware at a dinner party. Tsunade, meanwhile, was thinking that maybe her apprentice really was overworked, what with putting in up to 15 hours a day at the hospital, maintaining her training, taking semi-regular missions, and acting as an aide for the Hokage on top of all that. But on the other hand, if she didn't pass the buck on to Sakura, then Tsunade would have to deal with it. Nah, Sakura could take it. Get in here, Sakura. In front of her desk, Sasuke crossed his arms over his chest and refused to be moved. It was a bluff. It had to be. Guess what, Sakura? The Hokage said happily as the exhausted girl entered the main office. You get to take this brat's Genin team because he refuses to take the responsibility. Sasuke had a single instant to stare into Sakura's blazing green eyes before he realized he had always been right about Konoha. This place really was made of pure evil. End flashback. So anyway, that's how I got my little band of gophers, Sakura finished explaining with a careless shrug. You call them gophers? Naruto said, beaming, as he zeroed in on the most important part of the information he'd just been given. That's so cool, just like I have my duckies. Sakura cocked her head in confusion and studied her teammate, as though he may have acquired further brain damage while she wasn't looking. Naruto blinked, smile dimming. What? He glanced back at the kids and repeated, what? The Inuzuka boy explained, it's not gophers, it's gophers. Naruto, eyes narrowed in suspicion. It's not so much a nickname as it is a description, the girl piped up helpfully. Before Naruto could inquire any further, Sakura cut in. Anyway, now that you're back, I need a favor. The blonde perked back up. Sure, Sakura-chan. What do you need? Take my kids for a while. Naruto blinked. Am I even allowed to do that? He asked, remembering Tsunade's odd disapproval of the way he treated his own team. He shook his head. Besides, I don't think my duckies will like it very much. I don't care. Sakura snarled, eyes wild, as her patience, sanity, gave way with a nearly audible snap. I haven't slept in the past 4 days. I'm surviving off coffee and vending machine donuts. And this is the first time my genin have seen the sun in the last week and a half. I love them, but I can't deal with their incessant questions right now because it's only going to get worse. The annual Jounin medical evaluations are coming, which normally creates enough extra work, but this year I've been informed that I'll be held personally responsible for getting Kakashi-sensei to his appointment on time, which means I'll have to chase him down and drag him in by the ear. The hospital has just started a mass transition of documentation going back 5 years, so I'll have to redo paperwork for every patient I've ever had. I'm up for recertification in a week and have to take a written exam. And on top of all that, the Hokage, in all her wisdom, has seen fit to leave me in charge of running the Chunin exams, which are next month in case you didn't know. By the time she was finished, Sakura was panting for breath, cheeks red and eyes wild. So, Naruto hazarded through squinting eyes, you've been kinda busy? Sakura's hand snaked out, grabbed the hapless blonde by the throat, and pulled him in so that he dangled by his collar. And then she hissed at him. And that was how Naruto found himself leading 3 new genin to his team's designated meeting point. He wasn't really sure how to go about teaching them, especially all together, but he figured he could work something out. Probably. Or the Gophers and his duckies would have lots of fun playing together, and he'd just have to worry about extinguishing the flaming corpses later. Whichever. At least Kurama would have fun. Nothing was on fire yet. Naruto was proud to report. There had been a few mid-sized explosions, but then, you had to expect that when a shinobi's routine was disturbed. And Kurama had apparently found the whole thing tedious enough to run off, so that was something. The Bijou tended to have a sixth sense for the really good mayhem and always made a point to stick around when it was nearing, so everything would probably be fine. As long as Naruto didn't decide to kill something. Or someone. I want them to leave. Naruto's cute, little, purple-haired student screeched, stomping one sandal-clad foot. Yeah, Naruto-sensei is ours. Takashi agreed, suspicious eyes trained on the newcomers. Nearing 5 minutes into the same rant, Naruto closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and reminded himself, for the 6th time, that he deserved this for what he and his own genin team had put Kakashi-sensei through. I don't know you guys, Koseda said, changing the course of the argument at last. Naruto's shortest student had kept quiet until now. When the blonde Jounins had snapped up, it was to find the boy shuffling his feet shyly. I mean, Naruto-sensei just wants to help his friend by taking them for a while. It won't be so bad. Koseda's 2 teammates turned disbelieving stares on him. But Koseda wasn't paying attention to them. Instead, he was blushing and waving shyly at Kiru, who was waving happily back with a wide grin. Takashi's eye twitched. Megumi crossed her arms over her chest and huffed. Traitor. Naruto was barely able to stop himself from reaching out and squeezing the kid to within an inch of his life. A break in the madness. Finally, time to get this show on the road. Everybody sit your cute little butts down, Naruto said as he plopped to the ground, forcing himself back into a good mood through will and long practice alone. Why are you talking about my cute little butt? Yahiko demanded, eyes laughing. But Takashi didn't appreciate the joke. Shut it, he said as he reached out and smacked the back of the Inuzuka's head as he passed by to claim the free spot next to his sensei for himself. Hey, Yahiko growled, his puppy, Tsubame, adding her own discontented barks at his ankles. Hey, none of that. Naruto waved his hands at the boys placatingly. You'll get to beat each other bloody in a few minutes. This is group discussion time. Hajime crossed his arms over his chest and stared at the duckies disapprovingly. You have no discipline at all. Like you have any room to talk. Megumi sniped from where she had snuggled herself up to the Jounin's side in a blatant show of ownership. Back me up here, Koseda. In an ironic show that neither team had room to talk, Koseda and Kaoru were sitting off by themselves, giggling. Kozajiro, Kaoru's black puppy, was laying tummy up on Koseda's lap and being lavished with attention. Traitors. Koseda, startled at his teammate's snarl, nearly threw the small dog from his lap as he turned to face the other genin. Did you say something, Megumi-chan? She said, join the huddle, short stuff, Naruto called with a grin. Koseda always was the friendliest of his duckies. It was good to see at least one of his kids being nice. Naruto's face screwed up into a frown. It still didn't explain why Megumi and Takashi were acting so aggressive. But then, Sakura's boys weren't making things easy either. Once all the genin had made their way into the circle, Naruto put his hands on his knees and smiled at the group. I think we got off to a little bit of a shaky start, but that's okay. You guys weren't in the same class at the academy, right? There were shaken heads all around. That's what I thought. Yeah, Yahiko agreed before peering suspiciously at Koseda and his cousin, or, more to the point, the lack of space between them. How do you two know each other again? We met at the park a few years ago, Koseda explained with a grin. Kaoru hit him in the arm. Don't just put it like that. She turned back to her cousin. He saved Kozajiro when he got stuck up a tree. There was a long silence around the circle. Finally, Megumi asked the obvious question. Why was your puppy up a tree? Kaoru's face took on a defensive cast as she drew her puppy to her chest. Why wouldn't he be in a tree? The duckies shared a look. But how does that? Haijime sighed as Yahiko, voice exasperated, explained, Kozajiro wants to be a cat. It's a perfectly valid life choice. Kaoru snapped, glaring at her cousin. Naruto, who had always appreciated the oddballs of the world, looked at the puppy with new respect. Well, I've always been a cat person myself, the blonde remarked in support. This sparked a round of incredulous laughter from his team. Naruto blinked. What? What's funny? Flashback. It started one day when, disconcertingly enough, Kurama wandered up to Naruto, dropped a severed arm at his feet, and then stared up at him with his tails all a-wag. This behavior would always be a bit troubling, but at the moment it was especially problematic because Naruto was in the middle of a quaint little picnic with his duckies, and he thought the ragged strips of bloody flesh clinging to the end of the ulna might upset their stomachs. Naruto yelped in surprise and disgust, and took several big steps backwards. What's that? The fox glanced down at the severed limb and then back up at his Jinchuriki. It is an arm, Kurama explained slowly. I know that, Naruto snapped. I mean, why is it? Whose arm is it? Ah, Kurama said with new understanding. It was a fair question. It belongs to the missing nin that attempted to assault your kits this morning. But, Naruto pointed out, he ran as soon as he saw me. And he didn't actually hurt them at all. We could have taken him all by ourselves, Takashi said around a mouthful of onigiri. Be that as it may, the fox said primly, he attacked. There was a long silence as Naruto tried to understand how one thing related to another, and then he took a moment to feel bad for the poor sucker who had apparently upset Kurama. Well, Kurama prompted after several long minutes. Naruto's eyes shifted back and forth before settling on the bijou again. Well, what? Aren't you going to take it? The blonde Jounin's mouth dropped open, but he couldn't seem to think of anything to say in response. Giving it up for a bad job, he leapt to his feet, grabbed Koseda under one arm, Megumi under the other, and kicked at Takashi to get him moving. That's it. Lunch is over. Evacuation order beta. But Naruto shook his head and muttered out of the corner of his mouth. Kurama is having one of those days. Left behind by the quickly retreating Jounin and his team, Kurama narrowed his eyes in bemusement. That hadn't gone quite according to plan. As was the case for most events that would be scaring to a normal team, the incident was all but forgotten until 3 days later, which was when Kurama showed up to the field Team 7 had taken to using as a training area, dragging a torso, sans limbs, or head. This time, all 4 members of the team stopped what they were doing to gape at the spectacle. Well, 3 of them stopped, and Megumi stopped after Koseda failed to move out of the way of the piledriver she had sent his way. I have brought you a better gift, Kurama announced proudly into the horrified silence. Naruto answered. He looked to his genin for help, but Takashi just shrugged. Koseda looked nauseous, and Megumi looked mildly fascinated. Naruto turned his face away from that disaster in the making and settled in to repress the memory. And repressing in 3, 2, 1. He turned back to the fox. Oh, why? Kurama cocked his head to the side. Why what? Why the torso? The fox's nose wrinkled at having to explain the obvious. To eat, of course. Naruto said. Blinked. Another thing to repress. Busy day today. Kurama climbed to his feet unhappily as he realized something. You refuse to feast upon the flesh of your enemies? The fox asked with, he felt, understandable confusion. Yeah. Naruto hedged awkwardly. I don't really do that. Kurama looked from Naruto's face to the corpse he had dropped at his feet, to Naruto again. Finally, he nudged the body toward the teenager invitingly. It is good for you. It will allow his strength to become your own. Yeah, I'm okay, the blonde assured with a forced grin. Kurama continued to stare into Naruto's face, unblinking. The blonde sighed and ran a hand through his hair. It was usually better to just give in to Kurama's whims when he got like this, but, yeah, not happening this time. If you really want me to eat something you catch, he compromised, you could get me a fish or something. Kurama's eyes narrowed and he peered into Naruto's face for a long second before nodding to himself. I will catch you a moose. And with that he left, a demon on a mission. Eh what? Naruto yelped, hand outstretched after the bijous swiftly retreating back as the red streak disappeared into the surrounding grass. After a moment, Naruto turned back to his students with a dejected sigh and informed them, he's catching me a moose. Takashi rolled his eyes. You should have just accepted the arm, Naruto-sensei. Naruto blinked big, confused eyes at his student. What? The boy sighed. You've never had a cat, huh? When his teacher just stared at him blankly, he explained, cats bring the people they like presents. Presents? Naruto asked, eyes screwing up in confusion. Like poop. No. Takashi said, with more patience than his teacher really deserved. That's rats. Cats give you things they killed so that you can eat them, or possibly play with them, 'cause cats are weird. Little murderous psychopaths, Megumi said approvingly. Naruto shook his head. That still doesn't explain why I should have accepted an arm instead of spritzing his face. Because if you don't take it, they figure it's because you don't like it. But I didn't like it. Naruto yelped. So, the genin continued as though he hadn't been interrupted. They get you something better. Like a torso. Or a moose, apparently. Naruto's mouth opened to respond, before slowly closing again. Then he shook his head and demanded, but how does any of that even apply to Kurama? He's a fox, not a cat. Takashi met his teacher's eyes for a long second before turning to stare in the direction Kurama had run, then pointedly down to the cadaver at their feet. Naruto looked down as well. The missing knee didn't even look injured. No blood or wounds anywhere except at the stumps. Almost as if he'd just been batted around until he dropped. Naruto thought about this for a minute, and then slumped unhappily. Oh. So, Megumi interrupted. If you're not gonna eat that, can I have it? There was a long, uncomfortable silence as this statement sunk into her teammates' heads. Takashi took a large, unsubtle step backwards. Then Koseda broke the awkward moment by laughing in sudden relief. Oh, you mean to use as an anatomically accurate target for your Senbon? Megumi blinked once, slowly. Yeah, that's what I meant. And flashback. Naruto huffed indignantly. Yeah, that's what I said. I'm a cat person. Naruto-sensei, Megumi said gently with a hand on his arm. You have no idea how to deal with Kurama when he gets like that. And all of a sudden, the Gophers weren't really sure they wanted to be in the same prefecture as the Duckies and their very worrisome sensei. Except for Karu, who was willing to risk it for reasons that will go unremarked upon. Naruto huffed before clapping decisively. That's it, everybody. Just break up into pairs and get ready to show each other what you've got. Naruto blinked. Then he bit his lip, cocked his head to the side, got briefly distracted by a passing butterfly, then refocused and blinked again. I don't really know what I'm seeing here, he admitted to himself. Stand still so I can murder you. Okay, Yahiko chirped, his forward rush screeching to a stop, then pivoted just enough to avoid Takashi's fist as the other boy went sailing past, momentum unchecked. Oh, maybe next time. Arg. Naruto muttered slowly. It kinda looks like sparring, but he stared helplessly at the three pairs of fighting genin. It was more like, okay. So it seemed like Sakura-chan had barely trained her team at all. Why won't you just die? In attacking, dodging on the other hand, the Gophers had down to an art form. His duckies had yet to land a single hit, as far as he had seen. The Gophers had landed plenty. Of course, that didn't really matter when, as far as he could tell, they also hadn't inflicted any damage. At all. Kaoru had hit Koseda straight in the face, and the short boy hadn't so much as paused to rub it before trying, and failing, to land a roundhouse kick to the girl's ribs. His team was made of powerhouses. If they could land just one hit, any one of them would crush their opponent like a fly. But they weren't hitting. It was like trying to punch the wind. Naruto considered this. Maybe if they set their farts on fire, he wondered to himself, tapping his chin. Hyjime pulled up short to stare at the jounin, and only just ducked out of the way of Megumi's incoming Senbon. Switch partners. He called out automatically as his preset timer sounded. He focused back on his thoughts as his kids grudgingly switched sparring partners. Naruto was pretty sure his kids would win eventually. Not only did they have more experience, but the Gophers would have to slow down eventually while the Duckies, used to playing fetch with a very demanding Bijou, could power on for days if they had to. But then, Sakura's team had only been genin for half as long as his own team had. Naruto snapped to attention as an unearthly screech split the air, ready to protect his kids from whatever the threat was. But, well, he thought with dull resignation, at least he knew what this was. Two of his genin were pulling each other's hair and clawing at each other's eyes. Like rabid cats. They weren't even taking advantage of the obvious openings in their opponent's guard. That shit could just not stand. He marched over and grabbed the two by the backs of their necks and yanked them apart. He glared from one enraged face to the other, before huffing and demanding, "Kaoru-chan, what happened here?" On the sidelines, Kaoru flinched and glanced guiltily between the two dangling boys. Hyjime somehow managed to look as haughty and unruffled as ever, but while Koseda was trying, he just looked like an enraged ball of hair and weaponry. Naruto turned a surprisingly effective glare on the girl. She squeaked and hurried to explain. Well, Hyjime and Koseda paired up, and then 10 minutes previous. You have a sword? Koseda asked, wonder and no small amount of envy in his voice as the other boy summoned the weapon from a scroll. Hyjime smirked. Of course. Sakura-sensei gave it to me the second week of training after I made it clear I was ready for the responsibility. A condescending pause. Hasn't your sensei let you try your hand at one? Koseda scowled. No, Naruto-sensei had not. Flashback within a flashback. It had been 3 months since his team had passed the genin test. 3 months. Koseda had been telling sensei since day one that he wanted to learn to use a sword, but every time he so much as hinted at getting one of his own, something came up. It was always, not now, it's lunchtime, or Kurama really needs a bath, or the bushes are suspiciously on fire, and we should really check that out, so maybe we can talk about this later. Okay, bye. But this time, Naruto-sensei was going to listen to him. Naruto-sensei, please. I really want a sword. My mother is known for using one, and all of my sisters, and I have to be able to use one. He cast about desperately for something to add to his cause. It's my ninja way. That's what Naruto-sensei was always going on about, right? So he had to listen. Naruto frowned down at his shortest student in consternation. Koseda had invoked the power of the ninja way. Low blow that. Or, the blonde considered as he stared down at the earnest little face. Maybe he was just really serious about it. And if it was that important to him, then maybe he should let the kid try it. It was just, Sasuke had a sword. Sasuke had a sword, and did he really want any of his cute little duckies, especially Koseda, the littlest of the bunch, to copy the bastard? Naruto's frown deepened. No, he did not. Besides, only snobs use swords, everybody knew that. Well, snobs and AMBU. But AMBU taught their recruits how to use them in basic training. And you didn't want to be the loser who went in already knowing how to use one. Or the suck-up. Or something. And Koseda didn't want to be AMBU anyway, so it didn't matter. What mattered was that Naruto refused to turn Koseda into a mini Sasuke. He should totally be a mini Naruto instead. If Sasuke wanted mini ES, he'd just have to get a team himself. But then, Naruto thought as a proud grin stole over his face. His duckies were the most awesome genin around. Naruto paused as this thought bumped around his head. His duckies were the most awesome genin. Sasuke always tried to be the best and know the best moves and have the best, most legendary weapons, and now that Naruto thought about it, he'd probably want the best students too. Naruto's eyes widened as it all finally clicked into place in his head. Koseda didn't want a sword. That was stupid. Koseda was way too cool to want a puny sword as his primary weapon. No, Sasuke wanted Koseda to want a sword. Damn Jinjutsu-driven conspiracies. Yeah, no way. The duckies were property of Uzumaki Naruto. Sasuke, wherever he was obviously hiding out lurking like a pervert, was just going to have to step off. But how to go about simultaneously telling Sasuke that he was onto him and that Naruto wasn't going to take this laying down? A feral grin stole over the blonde Jounin's face. He was just going to have to show the team that these kids were already taken. He would just tell them it was for stealth training or something. Still standing in front of his teacher, his anger long since replaced with apprehension, Koseda shifted uneasily. And Naruto-sensei? I'm sorry that I eep. And flashback within a flashback. Koseda blinked out of the memory with a shudder. Orange. Megumi still hadn't forgiven him for that one. He suspected Takashi hadn't either. And that was the last time he had had the courage to ask Naruto-sensei about a sword. If that was the kind of cruel and unusual punishment it would bring down on him and his teammates. Yeah, sensei might have said it was for stealth training, but they all knew that was a dirty lie. So the only way Koseda was ever getting a sword was if he got one on his own. Unfortunately, Konoha tradition dictated that a genin's first sword had to be a gift from a mentor or claimed in battle. Even more unfortunately, tradition also dictated that the highest-ranked shinobi involved in the fight got first dibs on loot. And 3 guesses as to what Naruto-sensei always snapped up first? So no swords that way. Unless Koseda blinked and focused on the weapon in his opponent's hands. If Koseda wasn't wrong, and he wasn't, that was a Dotanuki blade. Good steel, nice heft. A sword that cuts through torsos. Basically, it was a really nice sword. Huh. Koseda considered that for a long moment, then screeched and lunged for his sparring partner's jugular. Present. Kaoru shrugged. And that's it. She was actually a little worried about Koseda. That kind of behavior was kind of like Sakura-sensei right before she started throwing the big boulders. Naruto let out a world-weary sigh. Now even Koseda, the good one, was acting up. Fed up with the genin bickering and their absolute refusal to work as a team, he dropped the 2, still glaring, boys and resorted to his old standby, his favorite instrument of threat and terror, Mr. Squirts. As one, the duckies scrambled into a defensive huddle, trying to ready themselves for the inevitable win. I'm not a bad dog. Yahiko howled desperately as he cowered against his cousin. Kaoru clapped her arms over her head and whimpered. Meanwhile, the pair's puppies had done the smart thing and hightailed it up a nearby tree. No one questioned how Tsubame got up there. There was a long silence as the duckies froze, staring at the other genin in shock. These intruders understood the horror that was Mr. Squirts. In their long, tortured experience, no one understood the horror that was Mr. Squirts. Swallowing his fear in a truly heroic display of bravery, Takashi snuck past his bemused sensei to approach the Inuzuka pair and stick out a hand. He glanced at Naruto with a gulp and then bulldozed on. We were wrong about you. Welcome to the team. You have got to be kidding me, Haijan muttered to himself, face disgusted. Takashi turned to appraise the other genin, unimpressed. You I don't like. Naruto watched the genin before nodding in satisfaction. This he could work with. Several hours later found Naruto stretched out languidly on a tree branch and basking in the sweet sounds of his kids setting things on fire down below. As a team. Yeah, he was an awesome sensei. They have not yet killed and eaten any of the newcomers. Kurama remarked with interest. Naruto didn't even flinch, used to the fox's tendency to appear out of nowhere. He did frown in the Biju's direction, though. Kurama, we've been over this. Humans don't. Believe whatever you wish, the fox said magnanimously. But as they are still breathing, I assume they have been allowed to join the skulk. Kurama rolled his eyes. The family. Oh, yep, I guess you could say that, Naruto said happily. Then he blinked as he noticed the body that the fox had dragged up the tree. And that is... Kurama glanced down. Lunch. The blonde shrugged. The dead bird was scrawnier than Kurama tended to drag back, but what the heck? He was getting hungry anyway. Cool. Thanks, buddy. He reached out and scratched the fox behind the ears. Takashi was saying he was in the mood for chicken. No, that's for you. Kurama snapped before relaxing back into his comfortable sprawl. I'll catch the kids something nutritious later. Naruto shrugged and accepted that easily enough. There wasn't exactly much meat on the thing, so the blonde picked up the bird, threw it over his shoulder, and wandered off to find a fire pit. Though if he knew why Kurama thought the scrawny, singed, bald carcass was an appropriate gift for his very favorite human, Naruto would have dropped it and fled the country. And he might have even remembered to grab the duckies on his way out if they were very, very lucky. One hopes. Unfortunately, knowing Naruto, he might have just shrugged and decided he was too hungry to let good meat go to waste. Either way, that was the beginning of the end. End of lunch. Silent 5. Somewhere along the way, Tsunade thought with a deep sense of resignation. She must have really offended some deity or another. There wasn't any other explanation. To come so close and have it end up like this. She could very nearly see retirement drifting tauntingly past her fingertips. She was supposed to be out from under her grandfather's horrible hat within 6 months of the brat coming back. That was the plan. That was the deal. And yes, his quirky teaching style had worried some people. His release of the Kyuubi had horrified others, but they had swept that under the rug fast enough and Naruto was popular enough for that to see them through. But this Iron Country, Tsunade reiterated disbelievingly, is declaring war. I said on the brink of declaring war, Koharu snapped. But Iron Country, the blonde repeated dully, the land of neutrality, the bastion of peace. That Iron Country. Yes, well, they got involved in the Great Shinobi World War, didn't they? Gave them ideas if you ask me. They've gotten uppity, Koharu muttered with the determined petulance of old warmongers the world over. And who can blame them? Hamura demanded. I certainly can't given the circumstances. Tsunade put her head in her hands and sighed. And we're sure it's Naruto's fault. It wasn't a question. She wished it was, but it really wasn't. Because the Kyuubi was Naruto's responsibility, and the Kyuubi was definitely at fault. And everyone knew it. It was kind of hard to argue uninvolvement when half of the Iron Country royal court, and who knew how many members of the royal guard had watched the nation's revered guardian spirit, out for a daily flight about the Grand Temple's courtyard, get grabbed out of the clear, blue sky by the suddenly present jaws of a 300-foot-tall monster fox. Not that the rat bastard had made matters any better by proceeding to shrink down to the size of a wolf, wink at the gathered nobles, and trot off with the thing's corpse dangling from his mouth. Usually even that wouldn't be so bad. Little things like a broken neck and bite wounds to the jugular weren't too big of a deal to a phoenix. No, had the world been a fair place, Fire Country could have apologized humbly and returned the rumpled, but no worse for wear bird to its contingent of diligent worshippers with only a minor political kerfuffle. Instead, Naruto had eaten the blasted thing. You had to ask yourself, how was that even a thing that happened? How? The damned boy had eaten a phoenix. This seemed more like a badly thought-out prank than reality. But it had happened, and now Iron Country was demanding reparations, primarily in the form of Naruto's head on a pike. Tsunade gave a heavy sigh and put her head in her hands. Whatever way you look at it, Naruto just proved he's not ready to be Hokage. Her forehead clunked down on the table. The ass. Outside the window, the two ENBU guards turned and blinked at each other through the eye holes of their masks. Koseda trudged home after a long practice session. His team and the Gophers, as Naruto-sensei refused to stop calling them, had worked together excellently, except for Hajime. Man, he hated that guy. Normally Koseda liked to think of himself as an even-tempered kind of guy, but that jerk's face just made Koseda want to start punching him and never stop. Wow, what's got you all worked up, Kosada-chan? Koseda looked up to see his oldest sister, tall and beautiful, and dressed in her flak jacket with her sword strapped to her back, starting out the front door of their house. He slumped. If any of his other sisters called him that he'd make a fuss, but with Yoshiko, it wasn't even worth it. Nothing. She gave him a measuring look, but seemed to decide she was in too much of a rush to pursue the line of questioning at the moment. All right, but we'll talk about this later, little guy. Hey, little guy was going just a little too far. The young woman ruffled his hair. Start dinner, okay? The rest of us have to go take care of something. Koseda frowned. All of you? It's kinda weird that everyone has a mission at once, isn't it? It's not a mission, exactly. More of a, never mind. Don't worry about it. Just go on in the house, get dinner started, and stay inside until we get back, okay? What? The boy started, alarmed. What's going on? Don't worry about it, baby. His mother soothed as she joined Yoshiko in the doorway. She was a tall, shapely woman, and though signs of her advancing age were visible in the wrinkles around her eyes, she was still more than simply lovely and remarkably unthreatening. But then, that's how she liked it. It's nothing dangerous. A bit of a situation has come up, is all, and the jounin have to go and fix everything before anyone else even notices, Koseda finished with a reluctant grin. Got it in one, his mother winked. Listen to your sister, and don't worry. We should be home before too late. And we'll be hungry, so make lots of oden. Miseo, his second youngest sister and a glowing 17, demanded as she joined the others. The boy huffed. I'm making curry tonight. You always make curry, Sahori complained as she stomped out, securing a few extra scrolls as she went. Then you should know to expect it, Koseda said haughtily. Why you? That's enough, the oldest Kunoichi cut in. We're late as it is. She gave Koseda a peck on the cheek and then started on her way, calling over her shoulder. Girls, get out here. The three young women that were already out of the house quickly followed their mother, but Koseda stayed well back from the front door. And true to expectation, a few seconds later his other four sisters came pelting out the door, jostling for position as they pushed their way forward. And yet, Koseda thought with his normal mix of admiration and deep confusion, all their hair remained perfectly in place, and their swords unmolested. Here it might be interesting to note that Kosada's 7 sisters looked nothing alike. Hair in black, brown, blonde, bright red, even blue, purple, and green. Eyes of every shade. Different jaw lines and brows and lips and noses. They only had 2 things in common. They were all tall, and they all had a sword. Yeah, well, Koseda didn't think it was funny. His classmates used to think it was strange that his family looked so different, but that's what happened when, well, Kosada's mom had a special kind of job. The way it had been explained to him as a small child was that his mother was so powerful and sneaky and beautiful, very important, that last one, that she had been selected for one of Konoha's most important programs. She was to risk her life for her village by going out into the world and making contact with the most powerful and influential foreign shinobi she could find. It had taken him a few more years to understand exactly what kind of contact they meant. To put it simply, his mother's children were all the offspring of different infamous shinobi from across the world, bred for genetic superiority, power, and the hope of gathering foreign bloodline secrets for Konoha. Except for Koseda. No, his father had been some gate guard his mom had gotten drunk with when she was off duty, and it was kind of depressing how much it showed. With a sigh, Koseda shuffled into the house and locked the door behind him. The funny thing about living in a ninja village was that, well, that it was a ninja village mostly. That basically meant what you'd expect, but there were a few subtleties that didn't seem to occur to outsiders. Like that basic medical supplies were half the price of what they were in the nearest civilian town, but most suites were almost double. Or that students caught cheating on school tests were given stern lectures on their messy technique. Or the fact that shinobi going on strike was considered dereliction of duty and high treason and was an executable offense. Yeah, civilians never seemed to think about stuff like that. As it was, The shinobi inhabitants of the village had to be a little bit clever in their ways of getting their point across. If you could call it clever, anyway. Creative certainly fit the bill. Over in Sector 54, Yimbu Agent Monkey was certainly not thinking about this. No, he was having some problems of his own. Namely, his mask was attempting to eat his face. Really, he felt it was important that he share this information with his squad, and, like the professional he was, did so in as succinct a manner as possible, mainly by screeching, "It's eating my face," and clawing at the obviously possessed porcelain clinging to his head while running in increasingly panicked circles. Raccoon, Monkey's field captain, would normally have thought of such behavior as a transparent ploy to get out of guard duty at worst, or a laughable inability to throw off a genjutsu at best, which was still pretty damn bad for an ANBU member. However, Raccoon had been in the field long enough to know what was what, and that mask was definitely trying to eat that man's face. Really. As such, he had no choice but to call in backup. Like the entirety of the ANBU Corps, not already on active assignment outside the village backup. Which is why no one was available to act as crowd control in other areas of the village as chaos suddenly, and quite coincidentally, we assure you, erupted in the streets. Chaos like what was seen in the Hyuga district. It was quite a sight to see. Or not see, but we'll get to that later. Yes, it was really something. What with the respected members of the Hyuga clan wandering the streets and bewailing their fates loudly, and at length, to the sky. Okay, so it wasn't actually that unusual. But normally they weren't walking face first into walls and tripping over their own feet as they did it. So tell me again, Sakura said soothingly into her clipboard, poised with her pen hovering above her report. What happened? Nothing happened. Hinata sniffled into a scrap of cloth that she seemed to think was her normal embroidered handkerchief. It didn't happen. We just realized. Realized what? The pink-haired girl encouraged in a commendably exasperation-free voice. That we're blind, Hinata wailed. At that, Sakura looked up from her clipboard to stare incredulously. Come again. I can't see. Well, yes, that's generally what blind means, Sakura acknowledged. It's just that normally when I think of the Hyuga, blind isn't what comes to mind. But Sakura-chan, Hinata explained patiently, we don't have pupils. How are we supposed to see without pupils? The medic tapped her pen to her lip as she thought about that one. You know, I think you're right. You all must be blind. Just terrible, Hinata agreed into her handkerchief with a sob that one could, if they listened just right, be forgiven for mistaking for a giggle. And across the village, things were even worse. As in, civil war was about to break out between the Akimichi and the Nara clans worse. Outsiders might be surprised about this turn of events, but then outsiders were always surprised in ninja villages. That was kind of the whole point. But the clansmen, so carefully carefree in public, knew that tension and resentment had been building for years. Insults long unavenged in the name of peace still weren't forgotten. But this time it had gone too far. This time the Akimichi had eaten a Nara deer. The two clans stood opposite each other, arrayed for battle. It was admittedly a bit strange that they had decided to go to war in the Central Market District, but the general opinion was that Shikaku must have had some reason for it. Master strategists always did. Shikamaru was standing a dozen yards in front of his clan by his father's side and glared steadily at the two Akimichi approaching them. Choza and Choji, acting as the delegation from the other clan, stopped once they stood several yards away. So it's finally come to this, has it? Choza asked heavily, in an oddly loud voice. You knew that it would, Shikaku announced grandly, since the moment you and yours impinged on our honor and violated the sacred truce between us. Dad, Shikamaru hissed, don't you think you're overdoing it a little? Nonsense, the man whispered back. I'm a pro at this. This kind of war is all about the show, son. He cleared his throat and turned back to the Akimichi. Now will you apologize, or will there be blood in the streets of Konoha? Choza crossed his massive arms in thought. After a moment he nodded decisively and said, I am truly sorry that I only got a small one. An outraged gasp went through the ranks of the Nara. The big man leaned forward, as though imparting a secret, and continued, It was delicious. Nearly purple with rage, Shikaku cried, "Attack!" But before the two sides were able to charge the field, an imperiously cleared throat froze them in their places. As one, the gathered clansmen and clan leaders turned to face the intruder. Kakashi, sharp-eyed and grim, had appeared between the two sides. He stared the clan delegations down until even the old soldiers were shifting uncomfortably. "You have something to add?" Shikaku asked suspiciously. "Now that Naruto has been judged ineligible for the title of Hokage, the elders have informed me that I will be inheriting the title." At this, the clan heirs blinked and glanced at each other out of the corners of their eyes. "Because really?" And Kakashi continued in a severe tone, "As Konoha is soon to be under my command, I have news that takes precedent over whatever petty squabble you're fighting over now." There was a long, tension-filled pause. From this day forward, the silver-haired Nin announced, all female shinobi will be required to wear tiny miniskirts. "Wah, that's all," Kakashi chirped before eye-smiling and clapping both men on the shoulders. "As you were." And with his normal panache for excellent timing, he poofed out just as a few dozen bladed projectiles, hurled by offended Kunoichi, struck the spot he had just vacated. Shikaku, Choza, and both of their sons stood in silence for several long moments. "They're making Kakashi Hokage?" Choza asked steadily. "Apparently. This can only end in tears." "Yep. At least Ino's already prepared." There was another long silence. "To the death." In a secure corner of a secure building, the Hokage, senior council, and assorted other high officials were holding a conference to deal with the situations that had cropped up. Tensions were somewhat high. So far, the second in command of the eugenics department was going to have to be replaced due to head trauma, and the personal assistant to the chair of human resources, the department in charge of all mismanaged and imported organs and tissue samples, was having a quietly competent panic attack. Koharu, bastion of efficiency that she was, had quickly grown tired of the younger shinobi and their prevaricating. She slammed a fist against the table, hissing, "There's no time for this. Other nations will invade if we continue to show such weakness." Meanwhile, elsewhere in the ninja world, a dozen or so foreign leaders were receiving frantic messages from their Konoha agents that could, as a general theme, be read as, "Danger levels in Konoha approaching DEFCON 1. Advise strategic retreat in Class 4 fortification procedure." As a note for non-shinobi, in civilian terms this may be better read as, "The Konohanin have lost it. They'll kill us all and eat what's left. Pull out, arm the gates, hide the academy students." "Calm down," Tsunade snapped. "We can contain this if we just act rationally." She took a deep breath and turned to her nervous student. "Now, Sakura, what was it you wanted to say?" Well," the pink-haired girl who had been meekly sitting at the back of the room bit her lip. "I have to take a leave of absence." The room full of senior shinobi stared at the girl blankly for a long moment. Finally, when Tsunade regained feeling in her face, she stuttered, "What?" "A medical leave." The girl hurried to continue. "You see, with my schedule being what it is, and all the additional duties and the last-minute missions, I haven't been able to have a regular sleep cycle for." "Sleep is for the weak, girl. Hamura cut in. "You can't just grant yourself a medical leave at a time like this because you feel a bit tired." No, that's not it," the girl stuttered. "You see, it turns out I have an underlying, though mild, sleep disorder, and the prolonged disruption of my circadian rhythm has exacerbated my condition so that—" "Get to the point," Koharu snapped. And Sakura did, quite effectively, by taking that moment to gently lean to the side and then topple to the floor in a dead faint. A moment later, she began to snore. "I think," Tsunade said faintly, "she's trying to tell us she's narcoleptic." They stared at the slumbering Kunoichi in a long, sober silence. "Well, shit," muttered Koharu. In yet another part of the village, inside a prominent pub, a very different type of fight was about to break out. Now, before we continue any further, it may be interesting to note that this particular pub was known for three things. First, it was known for being a central hub of gossip within certain high-powered circles in Konoha, and therefore Fire Country in general. Second, it was known to be the favorite lunch spot of the Nato twins, the brother-sister pair that had served as secretaries to the senior council for more than 20 years. The two were something of celebrities in the clerical and intelligence-gathering departments of the village, dedicated and paranoid. To the extreme, rumor had it that the pair had a sprawling network of personal reconnaissance seals throughout the village. And third, and most important by far, it was renowned for its award-winning curry buns, made with a chewy mochi center. The snack was often described as to die for, and more than one person actually had. And that was how Karen, Ino, and Sasuke found themselves seated around a table in the center of the restaurant with a heaping pile of curry buns on a plate between them. The three had been contentedly gnawing away for some time. Even Sasuke, who rarely had time for any carbon-based energy source that wasn't, in some sense, a tomato. After Sasuke had eaten his fill, he cleared his throat loudly and settled back in his seat. The two girls with him kept right on eating. Sasuke glared between the two for a few seconds in which nothing happened. Well, nothing caught fire. Sasuke was really concerned with the not on fire thing. Damn missing Sharingan. The young man took a deep breath, released it, and said loudly, "Stop eating." Neither girl heard him, or at least, they must not have heard him because they didn't listen or acknowledge him at all. And obviously Karen and Ino out of everyone on Earth would respond to him when he talked. Obviously. So they must have just not heard. Sasuke quietly set this burgeoning existential crisis aside and said louder, "I want you to help me have babies." Ino knocked her water over into a nearby patron's lap, although whether this was from shock or from being hit in the face when Karen sprayed bits of her own curry bun onto the blonde's face was unclear. "What?" Ino shrieked, catching the attention of the few patrons whose eyes had not already been locked on the spectacle. Karen just continued Heimlich ing herself. Sasuke settled back into his seat, content. All was back as it should be in the world of Sasuke. Ino stood threateningly from her chair. "What exactly do you mean by that? I came because you said you'd be treating me to curry buns, not to be propositioned." Karen shoved the other girl out of her way, and incidentally to the floor, and demanded breathlessly, "I get to carry your young? And we get to have sex?" Ino stood and sent an uppercut at the redhead's chin in one fluid movement. "What the hell?" the blonde began, focused back on the Uchiha. "Makes you think I'd even be interested?" She finished with, it must be said, an intrigued look in her eye. "How dare you?" The medic raged, surging to her feet. "Sasuke is offering a threesome here, and you can't even." Whoa, what?" Sasuke demanded, horrified. "I did not." "You sure?" Ino said, hands on her hips, "'cause that's sure what it sounded like to me." "That's what I heard." A helpful voice from the other end of the restaurant called out. "I don't want to copulate with you people," Sasuke spat, eye twitching. Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I don't like it when you mess with my emotions, Sasuke." She nodded seriously and said, "My cousin talked to me about this. Naruto says I can't let you treat me like that. And I think he's right. And he said that if you pulled anything, beating the hell out of you was the best way to." The dark-haired shinobi rolled his eye. "Naruto had to get into everything, didn't he? I don't want to do that with either of you. And it would take too long to restart my clan that way anyway." "No," his eye flashed. "I have a plan." "Oh goody," Ino muttered. "This never ends well," Karen confided to the other girl. Then she turned back to consider the young man. "Sasuke, I can see why it might seem like a tempting option, but I think replacing all the samples at the sperm bank would be a lot harder than you seem to think. I mean, the sheer volume of replacement tissue it would require alone would." "No," Sasuke cut in loudly. "Still too slow. I've created a jutsu. I just need both of your help to implement it." The girls glanced at each other. More out of morbid curiosity than anything else, Ino finally asked, "And what jutsu is that?" "It will impregnate every woman in Konoha between the ages of 16 and 43. "No," the young man shuddered. "Physical contact required." "That's stupid," Ino snorted. "It is not," Sasuke snapped. "I'd like to see the elders try to exterminate my clan again when it would anger every family in the whole village." "I think," the redhead corrected delicately. She meant the fact that it would cut the village's fighting force down by at least a third, send every husband, boyfriend, father, and You know, woman, out for your blood, and it wouldn't even work on every woman anyway. Well, that, Ino agreed. And the fact that the whole village found out your clan is genetically predisposed to insanity and obsession. Remember when that happened? It would so work, Sasuke snarled. Of course not, the blonde sighed. Karen crossed her arms and shook her head skeptically. What about women who are already pregnant? Or barren? Or, for that matter, have had a hysterectomy? Won't be a problem, Sasuke assured calmly. Ino sunk back into her chair, propped her elbow on the table and her head on her hand. This I gotta hear. Obviously the jutsu doesn't create a pregnancy the normal way, Sasuke snorted. So, Ino said tiredly. The jutsu is capable of creating its own womb if necessary. The child just needs the continued blood supply from the mother. Sasuke smiled smugly. It's even capable of correcting genetic problems in the embryo. Wait, Karen said slowly, a thought percolating at the back of her mind. If your technique can correct genetic abnormalities and doesn't require a womb then. And this finally seemed to be enough for Sasuke to turn vaguely sheepish. As it stands, the Uchiha admitted, it will likely also affect up to 20% of Konoha's men. Why you made an Mpreg jutsu? Karen demanded, eyes wide. Eh what? Sasuke asked, confused. The two Kunoichi glanced at each other. A lightning-quick conversation passed between the two, made of only facial twitches and creatively expressive eyebrows. They turned back to the Uchiha. Let's talk details. At a table across the room from the trio, a young Chunin was the first to snap out of the horrified staring the rest of the room was still caught in. He turned to the other two members of his team and, wide-eyed, demanded, do you feel threatened? I feel threatened. Haru Yamada was a mid-level clerical nin. That was what he did. It was how he was happy. Nice and safe with his paperwork and his pen collection. Every once in a blue moon, when his brother-in-law's mocking went a little far, he'd wonder if he should have gone into one of the more traditional shinobi paths. The answer was no. Now and forever, the answer was no. He knew because he had volunteered to leave the secure bunker of the clerical catacombs. And damn if he didn't deserve a medal for that. But the village was in such a state of emergency that every spare man was out on the streets already, and only he and the interns had been left, and now this had happened. It's just as I'm saying. Irika shrieked to the clerk who'd been unfortunate enough to respond to the school's alarms. The children have gone wild. It's pandemonium in the hallways, knee-high ankle biters darting out from the stairwells. Tage the first years dragged Sito-sensei under the lunch table, screaming, and we haven't seen him since. As Haru flinched back from the distraught teacher, a pair of particularly scrawny 8-year-olds, arms filled with aerosol cans and lighter fluid, skidded to a stop behind the clerk's back. They gave Irika an inquiring look. Without glancing away from the other man's face, Irika made a shooing motion with one hand and said, as you were. What? The clerical nin pulled back in confusion before glancing behind himself warily. But the students were already long gone. Several minutes later, as they stared proudly at the bonfire that used to be the school's library, the shorter of the pair paused long enough to grin smugly. I told you Irika-sensei was cool. Suffice to say that things in Konoha were getting a little intense. And with everyone so on edge and those in charge of keeping the peace at their wits' end, each shinobi was expected to remain calm and ready to assist his fellows. Sai was proud to give any assistance he could, such as warning his peers when they were in danger. Sai smiled calmly at Yamato. Yamato cowered in horror and inched slowly backwards. The younger shinobi glanced between his elder and the beautiful woodland creatures arrayed around him. Sensing the man's confusion, Sai attempted to explain. They are angry because your jutsu training has destroyed their forest home. But, Yamato stuttered, looking at the vicious, black creatures flexing claws and fangs in his direction. Those aren't real animals. You. Oh look, Sai observed mildly. They're attacking. Wah! Sakura watched her teammates run, one of them shrieking, but then who could blame him? Through the streets with a jaded stare. I should go do something about that, she told herself sternly. Then, with a decidedly shifty look, yawned loudly. Too bad I feel another nap, faint, coming on. With that, Sakura slumped contentedly against a conveniently located wall. Takashi, something weird is going on. The tall boy waved his teammate's concern off. Konoha is always a little nuts, Megumi. You're just overreacting because you're bored. The pair watched in silence as yet another Hugo walked fearlessly and unhesitatingly off of a second-story ledge. Megumi turned to stare at her tallest teammate, eyebrows raised. Takashi shrugged. That's not even in my top 50. The violet-haired girl shook her head and grabbed Takashi's arm to drag him behind her on her way to track down Koseda. He would work with her to find out what was going on. I'm okay. The down Hyuga snapped from behind them. The two duckies slowed to a stop. Is it just me? Takashi asked slowly. Or was that Hajime's voice? Hajime wouldn't embarrass himself like that for all the soba and tea country, Megumi stated. I'm blind, not a paraplegic. The voice that was not Hajime snapped. After a beat of silence, Megumi admitted, that sounded like him. Then they turned back around to stare. On closer inspection, it was clear that the down Hyuga was their irritable teammate. And it was easy to tell because Keiru and Yahiko were standing over him, alternately mocking and concerned. Sharing one last look, the two duckies wandered over to the others. Once they had crossed the street, Megumi asked, what's going on? The group of gophers looked up at the intrusion. Keiru perked up at seeing them. Hi guys. Help us convince Hajime that he's not blind. And that's necessary? Takashi asked cautiously. Apparently, Yahiko said with a long-suffering sigh. It's not, because I am blind, Hajime hissed, batting Keiru's hand aside with. It should be mentioned, excellent aim. Oh, Keiru breathed suddenly. That's what you guys are doing. It gets the job done, Hajime said stoically. Yahiko blinked at his teammates before a look of understanding blossomed on his face. Oh, that'll work, I guess. The Hyuga pushed himself to his feet with impeccable dignity. And I suppose the Inuzuka have thought of something so much better? The cousins grinned in tandem. You could say that. Elsewhere in the village, the Inuzuka had no idea what Yahiko was talking about. No, sir. They were having some issues, though. Mostly because the Aburame were weird and had odd priorities, and they were working on Tsum's last nerve. That was her story, and she was sticking to it. As it was, this was actually taking it a bit far. Like, really far. The Aburame clan was in mourning, which generally meant dressing in black and wandering around the village acting even more silent and morose than they normally did. They had reason, of course, what with the memorial service for the innocents senselessly killed planned for later that day. And the Aburame were silently insisting that the Inuzuka attend, mostly by staring at them eerily from just beyond the boundaries of the Dog clan's compound. Because the Aburame's dark sunglasses seemed to accuse, the Inuzuka were responsible. They had slaughtered children of the Aburame clan. The least the mongrels could do was come pay their respects. With a low growl in her chest, Tsum stamped her way to the main entrance of the compound. She planted her feet and barked. Shibi, get over here. There was, as ever, a silence in the milling throng of sunglass-clad shinobi. After several long seconds, the clan head weaved his way to the front of the crowd to meet Tsum's challenge. Is this really necessary? The woman demanded. Said Shibi. You're scaring the children, and the puppies won't even come out of the kennel. Yes, I'm serious, Tsum snapped. You're taking this too far. It was a flea bath. Lee walked down the street by himself. Stop. Consider that sentence. Now consider why it is the best sign you'll get that the end of everything is nigh. First is the fact that Lee walked anywhere. Lee did not walk. He ran. He skipped and sauntered. He dashed and frolicked and charged. He danced and trotted and raced precariously on his hands, and occasionally he limped, but he never walked. And second, Lee never went anywhere by himself. This was partially because Lee was a social creature, many would say obnoxiously so, and found friends wherever he went, whether they wanted him to or not, and partially because for the past year he'd had something of a stalker problem. Of course, Lee wouldn't say it was stalkers or a problem. No, he would say that his loving and beloved students simply wished to learn the ways of youth with every fiber in their vigorous little bodies and only wished for guidance. Everyone else said it crossed the line once the amorphous glob of green spandex Lee swore was made of 3 separate children had a raging, knockdown, drag-out fight over who got to wear Lee's spandex once he tragically, but inevitably, lost his life in glorious combat. Lee, who was the sole heir interested in Guy's own leotard, but was nevertheless willing to fight to the death for its possession, saw nothing strange about it. But now he was walking, and he was alone. Tintin, on the other side of the street, stopped in her tracks as she watched him pass by. Only she didn't so much watch him as her mind froze into a state that might, in a more technologically advanced world, be called a blue screen of death. But in this reality, she did not go into a blue screen of death, and so did not reboot. Instead, what we might picture as the hamster wheel of her mind slowly cranked out the only possible explanation. With a nearly audible ding, or what we might imagine to be the sound of a hamster nabbing a dangling piece of carrot, she arrived at the answer. Pod people, everybody run. What? Anko, across the street on a bi-hourly dango run, demanded shrilly. Orochimaru is here? Where did he hide the rest of the bodies? And that's when the real panic hit the streets. My face, Monkey wailed tiredly, marching waveringly onward. For hour 7 of his sprint, he was holding up remarkably well. His comrades, his many comrades, followed behind him in a long train, making occasional grabs at the aforementioned mask in an attempt to save the agent's life. Taking her scheduled turn, Sparrow reached out and gave the mask a yank. Unlike all the times before, it went flying and landed in the grass several feet away with a gentle clink. As one, the assembled ANBU turned and blinked down at it. The agent previously known as Monkey looked left, then right, then shuffled over to the mask and hunkered down next to it. He looked up at his fellows' blank white faces, shrugged, and picked it up. I'm on duty, he explained earnestly. It's against regulations to be without your mask while on duty. So he put it back on. A beat. It's eating my beautiful face, the poor man shrieked. And the chase was on. And therefore, Kakashi continued to the stupefied crowd. Aika is now the sacred text of Konoha and must be taught in all schools. The man clasped his hands gleefully and beamed into his future subjects' horrified faces. Isn't it wonderful? Smiling manically, Sakura marched the last few steps to Naruto's apartment door. Naruto, get your butt out here. Her grin spread even wider at the thought of Naruto's face when he heard the news. They had done it. The shinobi of Konoha had very succinctly proven their point. Konohani knew their Hokage, and more to the point, they knew their next Hokage, and that was Naruto. Sakura's smile slowly melted into a frown as she failed to hear the grumbling complaints and shuffling that she had expected. Naruto, how bad was he really feeling? When they had first heard the news that Tsunade didn't think he was ready, he had said he was fine. That granny knew best, and then immediately said he didn't feel well and was going to go lay down. You couldn't blame the poor guy, but she would still expect Naruto to be bouncing back up at the first hint of good news come banging at his door. That's just who he was. I'm coming in, okay? She called through the door. She pulled the spare key out of her hip pouch, turned the lock, and pushed her way inside. Listen, I've got good. Sakura froze in the doorway. The apartment was a mess, and not a young bachelor who lives alone mess, or even a Naruto searching desperately for ramen mess. No, this was a home invasion, assassins in the rafters, burglars sneaking in through the windows mess. Oh, and there was blood on the carpet. Somehow, she didn't think Naruto was home. Incident 6. All right, the young man called through a sharp grin. He was holding court at the largest table at the casino, and it was obvious why all eyes were on him. To sum it up, he very obviously came from old money. It was in the way he held himself, not trying to show off his wealth, in the form of fine clothing, finer jewelry, and protection charms and seals that left priceless in the dust, so much as completely oblivious that everyone didn't have it, and completely unsurprised by the number of admirers and hangers-on that clung to his sides. Or maybe he was a runaway monk of some order or another. Enough of them came from the nobility, and he certainly seemed to have divine luck. And if he wasn't from old money, he was certainly rich now. The youth downed a shot of something hard and so sweet, He didn't even notice the burn and shook 2 dice in his hand. With a devilish curl of the lips, he held his hand out in invitation for one of the barely dressed women on his side to lean in, just a little too far to be entirely innocent, and blow on the dice. For luck, right? The blonde asked, innocent and glib. The woman leaned even closer and smiled coyly. Right? Luck. Oh yeah. The youth purred before turning back to the game at hand. He had a large pile of chips by his elbow, a not inconsiderable fortune by itself, that had just kept growing all night. But hey, everyone was having a good time. Even the owners of the casino, watching their money pile up in someone else's coffer, were having a good time. Because this young man, well, he just had a certain charm to him. But then, the young, rich, blonde man wasn't actually doing anything too interesting. He wasn't even cheating, so who really cares about him? We have more important things to focus on. Things like this. Konoha is on fire. Well, to be more accurate, Konoha was on fire. Past tense. Now it's just slightly singed in some areas and lightly smoking in others. Pleasant almost, smells like a campfire. Nothing to worry about. And that's exactly how the PR department will sell it to wary clients and the daimyo's budget department when they're inevitably asked uncomfortable questions about the flammability of the average shinobi, property damage measured in metric tons of debris, and why the giant monster fox having a temper tantrum in the middle of a residential district was completely ignored for going on 45 minutes. The PR department will quietly fail to mention that it was mostly the shinobi who had been lighting the fires. But that's not the point. No, fire safety is different in Konoha than in most other communities. And so is fire insurance. The people lighting the fires had had one eye on rioting and one eye on the newly instituted, quietly held adage of the village, that being to flagrantly commit arson whensoever it was remotely possible to pass it off as an accident. This seemed like a strange rule to teach small children and professional assassins of dubious mental stability until you realized that accidental fire damages were paid for by the daimyo. The village also quietly failed to mention that Yamato could grow back the whole village's worth of buildings in about a week and a half with nothing but a scattering of seeds to start with. Hey, in Konoha buildings might grow on trees, but money still didn't. But that was beside the point. A conscientious observer might ignore all that and instead think to ask why the monster fox with anger management issues was ignored for so long. The answer came down to, he had been only one in a crowd of those rioting or panicking, but that sounds so tacky when you're describing shinobi or giant spirit beasts. That's still what they were doing though. Tsunade, on the other hand, she was on a rampage. And why wouldn't she be? Her chosen heir-cum-adopted grandson, not to mention one of the only blood relatives she had left, had been stolen out of his own apartment while an entire village had broken down around him to support his bid for taking her throne early. So really, what did she have to be angry about? Plenty, as it turned out. In a mostly cinder-free corner of the village, the duckies sat huddled together and didn't make a sound. They sat that way for an indeterminable time before Koseda let out a wet sniffle and burrowed further into Megumi's side. The girl let him, raising her arm to make more room for him against her side, but she quietly resented the necessity. She shouldn't have to do that. Naruto-sensei usually sat between her and Koseda. Naruto-sensei should be getting snot and tears rubbed into his shoulder, not her. Takashi, on the other hand, was an old hat at it and didn't comment on the growing wet spot Megumi left on his own shoulder. I don't get it, Takashi said eventually. You don't get anything, moron. That's not new, Megumi muttered without bothering to raise her head from his neck. Well, yeah, but this time I really don't get it, the tall boy asserted. I mean, Naruto-sensei being taken out? Naruto-sensei? Didn't he, win an entire war by himself 3 years ago? No, Koseda said, looking up to stare at Takashi strangely out of red-rimmed eyes. Naruto-sensei led the offensive, but it was the combined effort and will of every shinobi from every nation that won the war. Uh-huh, Takashi said indulgently. If you say so. He shook his head, but that doesn't negate my point. Naruto-sensei is badass. How could he have been banned? Takashi swallowed and started again. How could anyone have beat Naruto-sensei? Especially without the whole village noticing when, he blew a 1,000-foot crater into the surrounding bedrock? Koseda blinked. He does tend to do that, doesn't he? That's my point, Takashi enthused. Megumi cut the wind out from under him. They probably took him by surprise. Even the strongest fighter is still human, and Naruto-sensei was in his apartment, in the middle of his village, where he felt safe. And he wasn't feeling well. He was upset. He couldn't have been on his guard. There was a long silence before Takashi slammed his fist into the ground hard enough to leave a small crater in his wake. No, damn it. Naruto-sensei has to be alive. Takashi. No. Think about it. It makes no sense to kill him and then take his body. If you kill him, leave the body to make a statement. What's the point of killing someone like Naruto-sensei and then not taking credit? Koseda shrugged unhappily. To create an opportunity to invade in the chaos that his absence would cause, while simultaneously taking out the strongest defender Konoha has. The other two blinked at him. What? The short boy muttered. I'm just saying. Yeah, Takashi said after a moment. Except that no one has attacked. And at this point, the longer they wait, the only thing that's going to happen is that Konoha will get more and more organized, and more angry. Maybe that's what they want, Megumi wondered aloud. Maybe whoever did it doesn't want to attack Konoha. Maybe they want Konoha to attack someone else. Well, crap. Maybe we should tell someone? Koseda looked between his teammates for support. We can't let the village play into someone else's hands like that. Uffed, like they won't know? Takashi ruffled the shorter boy's hair. If you could figure it out, I doubt village intelligence had trouble. But that still doesn't explain taking his body. Megumi argued hotly. Wouldn't finding his bloody corpse hanging in the town square have made any attack by us faster and bloodier? She relaxed her fists enough that her nails stopped cutting into her palms to face her teammates. The two boys were pale-faced. Takashi especially looked to be on the verge of puking. Megumi blinked. And nice imagery there, the tall boy muttered. Exactly my point, the girl exclaimed. So, Koseda began, maybe they're trying to get us to attack, but they also need Naruto-sensei for something? The boy shook his head. But almost all of Naruto-sensei's best attacks are combinations of spiritual and chakra control combined in new ways. His body won't give up much information, and by now everyone knows that Kurama is barely tied to him. Plus, seals like Naruto-sensei's disintegrate with the bearer's death, so they wouldn't get anything out of that either. Then they must need him for something, not just his body, Megumi said as she thought it out. Then Naruto-sensei might still be alive, Takashi said through a tight throat. The genin clutched each other, faces burning with all the determination that made them Team 7. Let's go get sensei back. Meanwhile, there was a very important meeting taking place in the Hokage's office. It was important mostly because, spitting in the face of everything the shinobi nations had accomplished in the past years, Konoha was on the brink of declaring war. Proving once again that every war council should have a child member, to point out the obvious that everyone else is far too smart to notice, and that Jounin crazy was a viable disability. Sakura paced angrily in front of the line of Konoha's strongest and most influential. Strange how it mostly turned out to be people she'd interacted with regularly since the age of 12. She ran a hand through her hair and turned on her heel to face everyone and burst out. Can't you see this is the last thing Naruto would want? Are we really going to go against everything Naruto would have wanted to obliterate the ones who did this? Oh, well then, never mind. Yeah, Kakashi said, cocking his head slightly. That was my plan. Oh, well, when you put it that way. I'll get my battle axe, Sakura said brightly. So much for that then. We can't do this, Hinata said firmly. Naruto would never forgive us if we started a war over him, and we don't even have any proof that Iron Country was involved. Except that they were baying for his blood yesterday afternoon, Tsunade said archly, crossing her arms. And just look at their leader, Sasuke snarled. Kakashi frowned. What do you mean? Mifune has never shown himself to be particularly bloodthirsty. But he's so old. He must be evil. And since Kitsuchi has taken over as Tsuchikage, that samurai bastard is the only old cadre left. You're afraid of old people. Sakura said it in a voice that made it clear she didn't want to believe it, but had also been around for too much clan ninja crazy to hold on to doubt. She closed her eyes and repressed the urge to sigh. Of course you are. Sasuke just narrowed his good eye and hissed. Behold, Ino said dully, the father of the next generation. It's not a phobia, Sasuke snapped. A phobia is irrational. There was a moment of silence as everyone else in the room shared a glance over Sasuke's head. We didn't mention it being. You know what? Tsunade said, never mind. What we? And you, the one-eyed shinobi accused. You're the worst of all. You're not only an old hag, but you hide it, as if we can't smell it you. Okay, creepy, Ino put in. Think about it, Sasuke said, implored really, as he turned to face the other ninja under 50 in the room. Old people have committed all the worst evils of our world. Sure, Nagato and Obito made some unfortunate choices, Sasuke allowed with a dismissive hand wave. But that was only because they were manipulated into doing it by their elders. But, Shikamaru said, that's not. Naruto turned them both back to the side of good by talking to them for, minus the time taken for explosions, about 10 minutes each. But they still. 10 minutes, Sasuke repeated. Okay, fine, Shikamaru said, throwing his hands up with more energy than he normally did anything but seek vengeance. But 2 data points don't. Madara is the oldest person anyone here has ever met, Sasuke said. And he was a sweet little kid who only wanted to make friends and protect his family, and then grew up into an unmitigated monster that even Naruto didn't try to save. Well, yes, Shikamaru admitted, uncomfortable now, but... Danzo, Sasuke said, steely-eyed. But, the Nara tried. Danzo, Sasuke repeated. I see your point. Are we going to keep going with the crazy or get back on topic? Ino demanded. Because I can leave. I can go right now and leave you to it. I'll join you, Sakura said with relief. There was a reason Sakura had clung to Ino like a leech in the academy, and it hadn't only been because of the ribbon and the peer pressure. Mostly it was because even as a small child Sakura could recognize someone who didn't put up with bullshit. But before Sasuke could complain or Shikamaru could express his outrage of being lumped in with One-Eye McTraderpants, Irika barged his way into the surprisingly accessible secret meeting. The teacher, as per usual, looked agitated. He looked over the group of Jounin, ENBU, and council members, visibly decided to hell with it, and declared, I can't find the duckies. Really? Hamura asked snidely. The village goes into crisis and the first thing you do is hunt down a bunch of genin? Yes, I'm a teacher, it's instinct, and I can't find the kids. Naruto's or Sakura's. Sakura's head snapped around. What? Besides the momentary panic, finding the genin really wasn't an issue. Because Sakura, overworked yes, but also overprotective and paranoid of being left behind, had bugged the shit out of her students. Okay, so she may have inked the tattoo for a reverse summoning into the skin just behind their ears while they were sleeping, or possibly sedated. But hypodermic needles were slippery, and Konoha General just happened to keep needles filled with enough tranquilizer to sedate a moose readily on hand. Okay? It made sense when you thought about their typical pool of patients. Besides, Jounin-sensei did creepier thing than that all the time. Really. Seriously, Lee's students had been 3 separate people before he got to them. That had to count for something. But the important part of all this was that it didn't take more than a second and a well-executed expulsion of chakra to have a tiny slug pop into existence on Hajime's shoulder. And as the duckies had gone running to their new, nigh unstrikable friends before leaving on their epic quest to reclaim their sensei and future Hokage from what had to be an impossibly strong and cunning enemy, they never even stood a chance. The Hyuga pulled up short to stare at the summoned creature, making itself comfortable on his shoulder. He sighed, resigned. Damn. What? Megumi demanded, stopping alongside the boy with impatience written all over her face. We don't have time to stop. Yeah, what's the big? Yahiko trailed off, staring at the slug with wide eyes before his shoulders slumped. Well, there goes this trip. What? Koseda asked, several trees ahead of the others. He bounded back over to the others, eager to get going. We have to move. Oh no you don't. The duckies flinched as Sakura-sensei's harsh voice came out of nowhere. "What the hell is that?" Takashi demanded, looking wildly into the surrounding trees. "It's Sakura-sensei," Kaoru muttered, biting her lip. Her summon animals, the slugs, can transmit her voice so. "You get your butts back here this instant." The scary medic Nin's voice continued unimpeded. "Where the hell did you brats run off to?" A new voice joined their sensei's. "Now is not the time to throw a temper tantrum and rebel. And I should know. There are plenty of good times to rebel. Now isn't one of them." Sasuke, Sakura-sensei again, muffled as if she had put a hand over a mic. "Stop corrupting the children." "I'm just—" "Everybody shut up!" The Hokage's voice blared, nearly shaking the trees with its intensity. "You need not concern yourselves," a familiar voice crooned. "I have taken care of the issue." Kurama." Koseda spoke into the sudden silence. He leaned closer to the slug. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I've summoned the council," Kurama said lowly. The duckies could all but hear the fox's tail curling smugly over his toes. The duckies stared down at the slug, and by proxy the fox at the other end of the connection, for a long moment before, as one, breathing, "Oh no." The Council of Nine was unique in that it was both nothing and exactly like you would expect. It was a meeting of the 9 Biju, some of the most powerful spirit entities the world over. It was also, at its core, an awkward family engagement between 9 estranged siblings who would really rather be elsewhere, or at least be very drunk if they were forced to attend. This did not make summoning the Council of 9 in the center of the smoking remains of Konoha seem like any better of an idea. Of course, trying to cancel the meeting was an unspeakably worse idea, so there wasn't much to be done except lead the children and civilians to the most heavily fortified shelters and then coordinate which member of each response team was going to claim a choice spot to watch the action and which was going to bring the snacks. And because we're trying to be pragmatic and truthful here, the AMBU would need to be given at least another 7 to 8 minutes leeway to argue over whether to bring popcorn or takoyaki. But, and focus now, the point was that the Biju were, this very minute, converging on the village. Yeah, the PR department wasn't even going to try to field this one. There was one bright spot to all this, though. Long story short, Gaara was coming. Long story a little longer, after the end of the last war, the Biju had by and large not been forced back into their former prisons as the atomic bombs of the ninja world. Instead, with Naruto and his large, disappointed eyes acting as a moderator, they had signed treaties with their former villages and settled uneasily in the surrounding territories. Despite this, there was still bad blood between the shinobi and the spirit beasts, and reconciliation was slow. Except, people were equally unsurprised and flabbergasted to learn, between the young Kazekage and the One-Tail. In fact, the bond between Gaara and Shikaku was far stronger than that between the One-Tail and any previous Jinchuriki. It even went so far that Shikaku regularly submitted to carrying Gaara on long journeys, significantly decreasing travel time while increasing the Kazekage's safety. It was a great honor for all of Wind Country. Well, okay, initially it had been seen more as a mortifying embarrassment than an honor. Mostly because Shikaku didn't so much submit to carry Gaara as he picked the young Kazekage up like a kitten, with his teeth, and carried him off whenever the Biju felt like going on a stroll. But with the adage that confidence was everything, the village hidden in the sand embraced Shikaku as the noble bearer of the Kazekage. At least that's how their PR department was selling it. And Gaara? Well, Gaara got to nap on the way to wherever it turned out they were going. Gaara liked naps. Gaara was not napping now. Now Gaara was angry. It's interesting to note that very, very few people had ever seen Gaara angry, and to no one's surprise, none of those who had were yet living. Whole villages had seen Gaara sad or disappointed or determined. Or sleepy. That was also frightening. But never angry. But wait, that same conscientious observer from before might think, when Gaara was a child he couldn't go a week without going into a blood rage. See, that's where this gets interesting. Because those murderous rampages, they had been influenced by the One-Tail and emotional trauma and severe sleep deprivation. Yes, but really? That had been Gaara when he was feeling playful. Now, someone was going to wish he was in a playful mood. Naruto stretched, and leaned back against the dank wall behind him. This isn't so bad, really, the blonde said to himself, as he often did when he was alone. Mostly because it was a handy way to work exposition into a manga sequence. I mean, as a lonely childhood had trained him to. Sure, kinda dark and uncomfortable, he continued, scratching distractedly at the seals inked onto his wrists. But I get to meet new people, and that Roki guy seems really excited about the whole thing. Naruto paused in consideration. I mean, also kinda nuts, but still excited. So not so bad. There was a great burst of power and sound from the walls around the blonde, causing the world to shake, dust and bits of brick to fall from above, and Naruto to shield his head with his arms. Naruto, flinching backwards against the wall, muttered, "As long as that doesn't get free." He let out a vaguely hysterical laugh. Yeah, that would be bad. TBC. Incident Report 7. Hey, do you remember that young noble from the casino? Yeah? Well, I was wrong. Turns out he is kind of interesting. Mostly because he's so odd. Watch for a minute, and you'll see what I mean. The young man in question was in a city far removed from the resort town that had housed the casino, and on the wrong side of the tracks at that. Evening was approaching and the shadows were lengthening by the minute. But the blonde walked unconcernedly down the winding roads until he spotted something that piqued his interest. Hey, the blonde said loudly as he came up behind a thug he had found leaning against the wall of an alley. He prodded him in the back. Hey, you. Mr. Thug, or Thug-san as he preferred, was a man of young years, startling proportion, and a face so unfortunate as to only be rivaled by his luck in a name. Thug-san, despite appearances, was an upstanding young man frustratingly used to being harassed by local toughs who believed him to be a rival gang member invading their turf. He was actually just waiting to pick up his little sister from dance lessons. This being the case, he turned to face his current assailant with a dark glare and a ready fist. That was as far as he got before he was brought up short by the blonde's arrestingly charming grin. He said, feeling at once overwhelmingly uncomfortable and as though he had just been wrapped in a warm hug and encouraged to explain his entire, heartbreaking backstory. He slowly dropped his fist and asked, "Can I help you?" "Let's thumb wrestle," came possibly the single last response Thug-san had expected. The tall man gaped for a second before he managed to ask, "What?" "Thumb wrestling," the blonde youth in front of him explained, eyes all a twinkle. "I've always wanted to try it, but I never got the chance. Will you play with me?" Before Thug-san could work out how to respond to that, the blonde paused, visibly realized he had missed a social cue, and slapped himself on the forehead. "I apologize. Do you not know how to play? It's a remarkably simple game in its rules, but brilliant in application. A day to learn, a lifetime to master. They say, first you." I know how to thumb wrestle, but He trailed off as the kid's eyes grew even brighter and his smile stretched wider. "Guess I can spare a few minutes." What followed was the single most enthusiastic and least skilled attempt at a thumb war Thug-san had ever been unfortunate enough to be drafted into. That didn't seem to dampen the blonde's mood any. Instead, the youth stepped back after his third loss in a row with a happy sigh. "It seems I still have a lot to learn." Then he turned another warm grin on Thug-san, slapped him companionably on the arm, said, "Thank you for teaching me," and wandered off. See, that was weird. It gets worse. That was only an introduction to the blonde's strangeness. The real breadth of it didn't become clear until Thug-san's smaller and infinitely more attractive little sister found her brother staring numbly into the empty space the blonde had left behind him. Thug-chan's brother sent her a distracted nod in greeting before clasping her wrist in one large hand and pulling her along. She followed her brother for several blocks before realizing that they were not actually walking home, but, effectively, stalking a lost-looking but enthusiastically cheerful tourist. After a bit of a false start, she finally asked, "Nissan, why are you following that guy?" "I don't know," he said, sounding as confused as she felt. "But I think I want to be his friend." The girl said, looking from her brother to the bumbling blonde currently badgering a bewildered food cart worker into. She blinked. Were they playing cat's cradle? She sent an incredulous look up at her brother. "Why?" "I don't know," Thug-san repeated. "But I admire his philosophy. I'll follow him forever." Thug-chan grabbed her brother's arm and pulled him to a stop. Nissan, stop joking. You're creeping me out. I'm not joking, the big brother said with a frown. How can you be serious? That's nutty, Nissan. And that guy? She glanced over at the blonde. He's obviously a nitwit, She trailed off, staring as the smiling blonde harassed yet another passerby with good cheer. He does have a really nice smile, doesn't he? So, that's pretty weird, right? We gotta get back home, Takashi said, voice shaky, as he stared back in the direction of the village. He briefly hoped the smoke he saw rising from the horizon was a trick of the light, but quickly gave it up as a lost cause. But, Koseda said, biting his lip. But Naruto-sensei. Now, Takashi snapped. Before Naruto-sensei doesn't have anything to come home to. The boys' eyes met and sparked. They nodded to each other and took off for home. Still on her tree branch, Megumi sighed. I hate damage control duty. Then she sprinted off after her team. The Gophers stood, blinking and staring after their retreating backs for a long moment. Finally, Yahiko broke the silence. What the crap just happened? Back in Konoha, events were proceeding in an equally odd fashion. The Council of Nine was about to begin, though, so you kind of had to expect that. It started when the Seven-Tail arrived in a tornado of wind and power. He always had been something of a show-off, Kurama muttered to any who would listen. The Three-Tail and the Four-Tail arrived an hour later, snapping at each other's heels and making a general disruption of an otherwise fine market day. More than one enterprising shinobi store owner was planning to sell tickets. The Six-Tail made his way into the village at the leisurely pace that suited him best, and the 2, 5, and 8 tails filtered in shortly after. All that was left was for the One-Tail to arrive. In the meantime, there were a myriad of hurried conversations and last-minute meetings to prepare for the Biju descending on the village. Sakura, ever the responsible babysitter, took the most important job for herself. I want you to listen to me very, very carefully, Sasuke, Sakura said delicately after she had cornered Sasuke in his apartment. Only once Sasuke had sent her an exasperated nod did she say, Don't tell the Biju that you're Indra. Why would I tell them that? The one-eyed Nin asked, already turning back to his jutsu scroll. Don't tell them, Sasuke, the pink-haired girl repeated, voice firm. Sasuke sighed and let his scroll thump onto the table. Why would I tell? Sakura grabbed Sasuke by the jaw and held his face close to her own. Don't tell them. Okay, I won't tell them. Sasuke shook her off in a show of irritation and settled back into his seat. I don't know why you think I would. The medic shrugged. Honestly, I think you just like the attention. Here, because as a narrator I pride myself on clarity, I'll give you a bit of extra information. The Nine didn't have much in common besides a general love for mayhem. The fact that they'd spent the last several years, or decades, or centuries, as high-powered chakra batteries in the stomachs of a variety of, shall we say, imbalanced individuals, and that they were all technically split personalities of the same hell beast. Oh, sorry, divine being. But besides that, the Nine really only had one thing in common. They all loved their papa. Your daddy. Jokes were only funny until you realized who exactly they meant by papa. Then they were hilarious. But no, let's be serious. We're talking about ninja here, so the spiritual nature and likelihood of inciting explosions only made comedic stylings on the subject more likely. But it was more complicated than that when it came to Naruto. Because of course it was. Because while all the Biju knew that the Sage of Six Paths might have created them, they also knew he only did it because Big Brother Azura talked him into it. Big Brother Azura was their unanimous favorite. Yeah. Oh. The Nine waited for the One-Tail for most of a day. Most would agree that considering the distances involved this wasn't a long time, but most didn't have 8 giant, irritable hell beasts pacing outside their front doors. This wasn't helped by the fact that the Biju weren't known for their patience. Bad things tended to happen when Biju were made to wait. Death, destruction, the theft of large amounts of hard candy. Konoha didn't have to worry though. The duckies knew how to handle it. Megumi watched as Koseda nuzzled the Kyuubi, Keiru pet the Two-Tail behind the ears, and Takashi threw fish for the Four-Tail and the Six-Tail to snap up in man-sized, razor-sharp teeth. ANBU swarmed the other Biju in a storm of billowing black cloaks. That last part would have been reassuring if the ANBU in question hadn't seemed more awestruck and impressed than ready to defend their home. She was pretty sure one of them was trying to get the Eight Tails autograph. She only really gave up hope on the lot of them when she realized the agent wanted the autograph because he was a fan of Killer Bee's rapping. "Do you ever look around our village?" Hajime, standing at her side, said with resignation heavy in his tone, "and break out in cold sweats as you realize every single person in the village above the age of about 14 is certifiably mentally unsound." "No," Megumi said, voice bored, as she cleaned under her fingernails with a senbon. "Really?" Hajime said with slight surprise. "Of everyone on your team, you seemed clever enough to notice." "Oh, I noticed," Megumi said as she glanced up at the Hyuga. "I just don't start in on the nervous sweats until I start thinking about how many months, days, and hours it is until I turn 14. "Oh," Hajime said after a long moment. The girl smiled sympathetically. "Just thought about it, didn't you?" "Uh-huh." "Need a moment?" "Just a second." The violet-haired girl nodded and returned her attention to her nails. "I'll wait." "It's really not as bad as all that," Kakashi soothed as he wandered towards them, cheerful eye smile in place. "If you want some advice, I'd say." "Please," Megumi scoffed. "You were 14-year-old crazy at 8. And you were Jounin crazy by 13. Kakashi paused, cocking his head in thought. "This is true, but," he lifted one imperious finger, "that just means I'm better suited than most to teach you how to cope with it." The Genin thought on that for a moment, then eagerly gathered around to hear the silver-haired shinobi's wisdom. Unfortunately, that was as far as they got before their attention was caught by the clearing of a massive throat. With firm dignity, Gaara looked down at the gathered shinobi and Biju from his position swinging from the Ichibai's mouth and gave a solemn nod of greeting. The council was begun. "Okay," Tsunade said slowly, one hand pressing at the bridge of her nose, mostly to keep her head from exploding. "Before you continue with your meeting, we need to set some ground rules." The QB gave a superior sniff and took a step forward. "I know these rules of which you speak." He sent a look at his siblings. Utterly useless, but repeating them seems to calm the mortals down. "I'm waiting," Tsunade said without humor. Kurama cleared his throat and began. "I will avoid the place in which you store the newborn kits and the wounded, which makes it so much easier for a predator to wander over and eat them all at once." He sent the Hokage a significant look, but she seemed to miss his hint. He sighed and began again. "Neither will I approach the kit prison." "The what?" Shizen asked in a whisper to her leader. "The academy," Tsunade muttered back. "Oh," Shizen said, then shrugged. It was accurate enough. "I will not attack the kits. I will not swallow the kits, even in jest when I intend to spit them out later." "And," the Hokage demanded. "And," Kurama said with all the irritation a spirit of rage could muster, which was a lot, "I will not chew on any of the humans. Or step on them. No matter how irritating they are." Kurama sent a side eye at her and continued, unapologetic, "or how much they obviously deserve it." Tsunade sighed tiredly. "How would you deal with one of your kind who irritated you?" The Bijou sent her an even stranger look. "I'd step on them." Remember how Tsunade had her hand at her head to keep it from exploding? That was a bit of an oversimplification. Actually, it was there so she could instantaneously heal the inevitable aneurysm as it happened. Good thing, too, because it just paid off. What remained of the Konoha 12 gathered in their favorite pub to strategize, which was a clever code for gossip and wine. The 9 Jounin, Naruto being missing, and Sakura and Shikamaru being tied up in strategy sessions with a more political crowd, had commandeered a corner and enough tables for them to stretch out. "It's too bad Gaara turned up," Kiba grumbled into his drink. "Hey," Tenten snapped. "Gaara has been a staunch ally for years. You can't keep holding his childhood against him." "I don't mean it like that," Kiba waved off her comment with a sigh. "I just thought Gaara had been the one to grab Naruto at first. At least if it was him, we'd know Naruto was safe," Kiba said grumpily. "You know, locked in Gaara's closet being hand-fed grapes, but safe." "What?" Lee said with a confused frown. Gaara only respects Naruto as a fellow warrior. Ino pat the other jounin on the shoulder. Sure, you go on thinking whatever makes you happy. I'm not saying Gaara doesn't respect him as a warrior, Kiba protested. I'm just saying if we were to auction off Naruto's favorite childhood stuffed animal, between Gaara and Hinata, we wouldn't have to collect taxes for the next 3 to 4 years. Hinata, having long since taken possession of the frog plush in question, let that comment slide. Frankie, I'm surprised the Biju agreed to come just because Naruto went missing, Tenten opined. Are you serious? Niji said, rising his chin imperiously. Naruto saved them, not only from Kaguya, but from a life of confinement and they don't even care when their actual siblings get abducted, Tintin cut in. I don't see why Naruto should be special. He has a point, Ino said speculatively. I mean, it's even a historical tale in Rock Country. When the Four-Tail was captured, the Seven-Tail came. The earth started to shake with the beast's roars, and the villagers thought they would all be killed because the Kaguya was still too weakened from the battle to fight off another tailed beast. That was about when they realized the Seven-Tail was laughing. And then it came and blessed the whole village, but only after finding the new Jinchuriki and punching him in the stomach. That's taking sibling rivalry a little far, Sasuke muttered. Without quite knowing why, Sasuke paused as his words replayed in his mind. Shifting in his seat, his brow wrinkling in sudden disquiet, he thought about that as the others droned on. He realized in that moment that of all his relationships with all of his siblings and all of his past lives, his relationship with Itachi had actually been the most functional and affectionate. And that scared even him. Meanwhile, the village council was having its own meeting. So we just go up to Mifune of Iron Country and inform him that if he doesn't give us Naruto back, we'll eradicate him and all the dirty bastards that follow him and everything they stand for from the earth, Kakashi summed up the plan. There was a round of agreeable nods from the rest of the room. Seems simple enough. This is your fault, Matatabi the Two-Tail snarled. You didn't take good enough care of Big Brother. I take excellent care of the brat. I water him. I take him for walks. Admittedly, the one time I tried to give him a bath, he slapped me across the muzzle and wouldn't stop acting traumatized for a week. But the point stands. Gaara, listening to the Biju continue their argument, scowled deeply. I thought we were discussing how to rescue Naruto, the redhead demanded, feeling strangely used. It was as if people thought he would do anything if they only dropped the blonde Jinchuriki's name into the conversation. The fact that it was true had no bearing. The Gobai rolled his enormous eyes. Naruto is our brother. Gaara, still more than half asleep and possibly not at his most lucid, blinked slowly and considered the Biju's words. The Kazekage had never been informed of the more delicate details of the Senju clan's family tree, because Tsunade didn't talk about it with anyone that she wasn't legally obligated to, and Naruto couldn't keep track of who already knew. So he came to the only logical conclusion left. He looked up at the Kyuubi and tried to imagine how the monstrous fox would look in a wedding dress. Blank-faced as ever, the redhead quietly said to himself, "That is more than I ever wanted to know about Naruto's sex life." It's not my fault the boy wouldn't eat what I caught him, Kuruma growled, regathering the council's scattered attention. He's too damn picky. I brought him the livers of free beasts. But was that good enough for the brat? No. I brought him the heads of his enemies. But was that good enough? No. So I had to take it up a level. Kurama settled more comfortably into his spot and preened. Great moon koi. Matatabi guessed with an intrigued rumble. I tried a white moose, but no, Kuruma said with a sniff. He wouldn't eat the regular meat I brought him, so I fed him a phoenix. There was a moment of nearly perfect silence around the circle. You what? It was an irritated and long-suffering eight-tail that came to the Hokage's tower to tell the humans what had happened. Kuruma hides it well, but he's kind of a moron, Gyuki explained apologetically. You're actually trying to convince me that Naruto wasn't kidnapped, he's possessed? Shizun demanded incredulously. That's our working theory, the eight-tail agreed. Possessed by the phoenix, he cooked over a fire and ate, Shizun clarified further. That'd be the one, Gyuki said with a nod. Phoenixes are weird like that. I guess that's a good thing, the medic Neen and part-time secretary said. At least we won't have to declare war on Iron Country. Shizun halted mid-word, turning pale as sour milk. A split second later, she had vaulted over her desk and blown the Hokage's door off its hinges on her way into Tsunade's office. And I'll see your heads hanging from my academy's rafters before the end. Tsunade snarled and slammed her hand down to cancel the communication jutsu. The blonde Hokage glanced up at her frantic assistant and smiled with satisfaction. Well, that's done. Shizun stared down at the shattered communication sigil and all it represented. Well, shit. Extra material that didn't fit this chapter. Sabaku's siblings were as surprised as everybody else by the turn of events. I thought your current Jinchuriki hated you, the go-by said, looking at the weakest of their number with confusion. Again, for a second, possibly third, separate time. No. We've been getting along much better since Naruto gave me some advice, Sabaku said with a firm shake of his massive head. The other-tailed beast cocked its head curiously. What was it? Well, the Ichibai said, it's been a while, but I think it was something like. We've talked about this. Communication is key. You have to go and actually talk to Gaara, and I don't mean sneaking under his floorboards and whispering to him as he falls asleep, so he panics and thinks you're possessing him again. No, I don't care how funny you think it is. Yeah, Sabaku said thoughtfully, that was it. Wow, the go-by said with wide eyes, that is good advice. And it seems so simple once you hear it. Incident Report 8. Sasuke had been sulking for last 3 hours, and Sakura had been blissfully enjoying the quiet. Had been, because as she heard him start to shift, she looked up from her paperwork with a studiously attentive face. You just don't understand, Sakura. You've never understood, Sasuke, I distraught moaned. He's my rival. I have to be the one to find him. But the Biju are the ones in charge of this part of the search, Sakura reminded helpfully, and they'll probably eat you if you try to tag along. But if I tell them that then they'll definitely eat you, she said flatly. But what did I say about that? Sakura snapped. Don't tell them, Sasuke repeated in the voice of a moody 3-year-old. Sakura kept eye contact for another second before nodding and going back to her paperwork. Sasuke collapsed face first on the desk and settled in for another bout of sulking. This is why Sakura had finally moved on from Sasuke. Oh, it wasn't that she couldn't take the melodrama or the angst. She was a shinobi. Melodrama and angst were par for the course, and incidentally, low tolerance was one of the things most likely to delay promotion to Chunin. No, it was more all the surprise incest that had broken the deal. It was simple when it came down to it. Naruto and Sasuke were brothers first. Azura and Enduro were brothers and rivals and best friends long before they were enemies. By the time Naruto and Sasuke came down the pipes, the two souls had already been circling each other for over 1,000 years in dozens of different lifetimes. And then there were Hashirama and Madara, a pair made in, well, somewhere. They shared dreams of a village and goals about a village and friendship founded on building a village. Brothers in everything but blood. Not that either of the overinflated idiots had a damn clue how to actually run a village, let alone found one. And not that they had ever acknowledged it, but that was why they had needed Tobirama, even if half the time it seemed like the pair forgot he was even there. Tobirama had been a latecomer to the brother-rival platonic life-mate party, and he was never really going to catch up. The second Hokage had become the second because he was the only one with the skill to set up the infrastructure, regulations, and laws needed to maintain a lasting village. Sure, Hashirama was great, a visionary even, a master at creating hope and the core ideas of the will of fire. He made people believe a lasting peace between clans was possible and, in doing, made it so. Without that, Konoha would have remained just a dream. And Madara, he had the raw power, intimidation, and, when it came down to it, sex appeal to gather other clans for the cause. But had either of the idiots ever thought about retirement plans? Pay scale increases? Maternity leave? Please. Sakura sighed. And that was exactly why this time, in this life, she wasn't even going to try. She reached out and pat Sasuke consolingly on the shoulder and reaffirmed her vow that this lifetime she was going to rule from so far behind the throne no one would even know she was there. Sure, She might occasionally have an 18-hour day, or 4, but that was nothing compared to what she had to do to clean up the mess when she had worn that hat after her big brother was done with it. Sakura was planning to retire to tea country the very day Naruto tried to give her an actual position in the government. Oh, she'd cover by saying she was setting up a lab or clinic to increase Konoha's influence in that part of the world and create new medical techniques. It would even be the truth. It's just that that's what an easy retirement meant to Sakura. She was so looking forward to it. In Training Ground 17, the only field big enough to comfortably hold all 9 Biju while still being far enough away from the main village that Tsunade was unlikely to be forced to fill out any extra emergency paperwork, some level of emergency paperwork being a constant. The council were making last-minute preparations for their journey. They were about to venture forth on a rescue mission, or at least to gather information for an eventual rescue. Or at the least, they were leaving Konoha before their bickering got out of hand, and Tenzo had to regrow the village for a second time in 2 days. He was going to start demanding a cushy bonus soon, or possibly extra vacation days. If he was just a touch less loyally devoted to the village or a tad more economically savvy, he would already be demanding way more than that, like possibly the key to Konoha's treasury and the Hokage's hat. "Are we ready to go?" the Hachibi asked, looking around to assess how the group was doing. "I'm all packed," Shikaku called. The Hachibi looked over at him, saw half of Gaara's sleeping face and a dangling arm peeking out from a travel sack hanging from the giant raccoon's mouth, and sighed. Anticipating the problem, Kurama decided to help. "You can't take humans with you into the spirit world, idiot," Kurama snapped from where he was hunkered down at the edge of the group. "You're taking them," Shikaku protested, dropping Gaara to the ground in a cloud of scattered dirt. Gaara, unbothered and sound asleep in his travel sack, rolled over and snuggled more tightly under the blanket. Kurama scoffed, shifting his tail under his front paws for him to knead soothingly. "The kits aren't humans." "Yes, we are," Takashi yelled, without bothering to look up at the Biju from where he was trying to stuff another supply scroll into an already overstuffed pocket. "They belong to me," Kurama continued to explain, completely ignoring the children in question. "I have taught them." "We've known you like 3 days," Yahiko called up at him. "Fed them," Kurama continued. "And we all know how well that goes," Kare muttered, and decided not to kill and eat them for taking up Big Brother's time. The kids, no fools they, held their peace at this one. They are honorary Biju now, and that is all there is to it. The fox finished with satisfaction. "Is that how that works?" Koseda muttered to Megumi out of the corner of his mouth. She shrugged and got back to stuffing another improbably sized and outlandishly sharp weapon into her knapsack. "Okay," Shikaku said with a mollified nod of his head. "That's fine then, because Gaara's an honorary Biju too." "He is not." Kurama sat up with a start, outraged. "Why not?" Shikaku demanded. "I've done all that for him too. That makes him mine, right? I mean, I had this kid convinced I was his mother until he was 13. That's gotta count for something." "It counts for him being almost as stupid as you are," Kurama snapped with narrowed eyes. "Hey," Shikaku growled. "Gaara isn't stupid." He paused, blinked. "Wait." Kurama snorted and turned his back on the raccoon. "Besides, I'm the leader, so what I say goes." "You're not the leader," the two-tail hissed, not one to let a good argument pass her by. "Yeah, moron," the three-tail said. "What would give you a dumbass idea like that?" "Because," Kurama said calmly, "I'm the strongest." "Like hell." And then all hell broke loose. Hajime watched this clash of titans for a long moment before turning at the other honorary Biju and demanding, "No, seriously, why are we going?" "So we can save Naruto-sensei," Megumi said without looking up from what she was doing. Hajime opened his mouth but closed it again without saying anything. One could argue about not wanting to be counted as a Biju or not wanting to go to the spirit world, or even about not wanting to ride on the back of a ravaging hell beast through dimensions. But it was bad form for a ninja to argue that he didn't want to do just about anything to save the next Kage of his village. Also, Naruto just tended to win people over that way. "Are we sure we have everything?" Kaoru asked, lugging her bag over to the circle of the other genin. "I have everything I'd bring on a normal training trip, and extra provisions. But the spirit world? Not really sure about what we'll need there. I brought dumplings for offerings, Koseda said, looking up at her with a smile. I should have enough for all of us if it turns out we need them. He thought briefly of the mounds and mounds of dumplings and hundreds of tangerines he'd sealed away in the special food preservation scrolls Naruto had forced on him the first time his sensei had tried Koseda's cooking and nodded to himself. It should be enough. What the hell are you talking about, Koseda? Takashi asked, glancing at him. Why would we give your dumplings as offerings when we could eat them? I mean, have you tasted your dumplings? And why do we need offerings? Yahiko demanded, flopping down on the ground next to his cousin. We are going to the spirit world, Koseda said, incredulous. I think it might become important, don't you? Spirit world, the Inuzuka said, eyes wide. I thought we were just going to the summon plane. Yeah, what did you think the summon plane was? Megumi said, rolling her eyes. She hefted her pack up on her shoulder and turned her back on her fellow Genin to face the Biju. Are we ready to go yet? The rest of the Genin looked over at the Biju and blinked. The Biju were in a pile, a mass of fur and scales laid out over most of the clearing and a good part of the forest beyond. The six-tail was half visible on the bottom and apparently sleeping comfortably. Shikaku was gnawing on two of Kurama's tails, and the fox was pressing one giant paw into the raccoon's face in retaliation. The eight-tail was sitting out of the line of fire, muttering to himself about being the only sane one left. How the hell did we miss this happening? Yahiko said, awe and horror making his voice quiet. You get used to them pretty fast, Megumi said with a slight shrug and an uninterested face. Background noise, really. She turned her attention back on Kurama to call. Come on, Fox. I got shit to do. Let's get a move on. Kurama reluctantly stopped gnawing on the tip of Shikaku's captive ear, and then spent several comical seconds trying to spit out the fur stuck to his tongue. Megumi sighed in extravagant exasperation. Kurama glared at her for a second before grinning and bringing his head down, quick as a snake, to lick a wet stripe up her face and most of her body. I'm so proud of this one, he told his siblings as Megumi flicked the saliva off her face with the same level expression she wore in almost all circumstances. So disaffected, so darling. Just as a kid of mine should be. Yes, but are we leaving yet? Megumi repeated. Kurama sent his siblings another telling look and then turned back to the girl. We are ready. Let us go. Without further delay, he reached out with one paw, extended his claws, and slashed at thin air. Except, it seems something had been there after all, the fabric between worlds. And like a cat's claws in an old Andy's favorite couch, it shredded straight through reality with a second's effort. The Gophers looked up at Kurama and, for possibly the first time, really started to comprehend what type of being they were in the presence of. Woohoo, here we go, Koseda cried, grabbing Keiru's hand and dragging her with him as he leapt onto the top of Kurama's head. Hey, she shrieked, stumbling on the warm, fur-covered ground beneath her feet. She gulped, looking into Koseda's guileless face, and sat down with a wobbly smile. Megumi was sitting on the fox's neck with Hajime precariously balanced behind her. Yahiko was perched on his back and Takashi was comfortably sprawled in the ridge of fur between the fox's giant shoulder blades. And with no more than another second of delay, the Biju, and honorary of the same, stepped lightly and sped through from one realm to another. There were 1,000 swirling colors and lights and hues that didn't exist in the normal world, and an odd, horribly stretching sensation as if, without noticing, they were being pulled out like that one ninja clan with bodies made of rubber. They landed a bare second later, with a light thump and the sound of retching. Really, Takashi said to Yahiko, rolling his eyes. Hold it in, you wimp. Shut up, the boy muttered, both hands held over his mouth. Are you a ninja, or aren't you? Yahiko sent him a dark glare. Well, if you actually puke you'll be doing it on Kurama's fur, Takashi said, unimpressed. What was that? Kurama said, peering over his own shoulder at them with one giant eye. And suddenly I feel all better, Yahiko said faintly. I think you're lying, Yahiko, Tsubame said from her perch in the boy's arms, worried. I told you, you shouldn't have eaten such a big lunch. I'm not lying, the Jinin denied hotly. If I say I feel better, then I'm all better. That's exactly what you said that time you fainted right after. Shut up about that. Yahiko squeaked, both hands clamped around her muzzle. Takashi stared at the two of them for a long, long moment. So, am I the only one who realized the puppy is talking? Why wouldn't Tsubame be talking? A young male voice asked, audibly confused. Takashi started at the unfamiliar voice and tracked it back to its source, the small puppy sitting at Keiru's feet. Whoa, the Jinin yelped, jumping back. Another one. What are you yammering about now? Yahiko demanded, letting go of his puppy to place her back up on his shoulder. Your dogs are talking, Takashi snapped. But they've always talked, Keiru said, incredulously. They're Ninken. You knew that, right? I know Ninken can talk, Takashi snapped. But that's when they get older. Neither of your puppies can. No, Kosajiru said with a lolling tongue. We can definitely talk. Did you think the Inuzuka were just talking to themselves, or something? It just takes us a while to learn how to make the dumber humans understand what we're saying outside of our home realm. Oh, Takashi said after a moment of processing time. Wait a minute. Too late, Megumi said, scanning the horizon. You brought that one on yourself, Takashi. There was general agreement from the rest of the Jinin. Although, did the Inuzuka puppies count as Jinin? That was worth checking into. No. Hey, that's not fair, Takashi complained. I knew they understood. I'm not an idiot. But I figured if they weren't talking, it's because they couldn't. It all has to do with spirit communication and psychic links, not actual talking. I don't even understand it too well, Yahiko allowed, already bored of the conversation. Instead, he focused on looking around the new realm they had landed in, and tried not to feel too disappointed. By and large, it looked exactly like the place they had just come from. It was a large forest, green with trees and underbrush and moss. To be objective, a human from anywhere but Konoha would be markedly more impressed by the trees, hundreds of feet tall, twisting monoliths of bark and thick foliage and age. But the Gophers were from Konoha and had never been outside its borders to compare the chakra-enhanced trees native to their lands to the small, scraggly bushes that passed for trees in other parts of the world. And so the twisting, haunting wood in which the Jinin found themselves was dismissed as more of the same. The Duckies knew a little better. They'd been outside of the borders of their village just enough to recognize the difference. But if anything, the similarity of the trees to their home just made them feel they were in familiar territory. What are you little jerks talking about now? Shikaku sat around the obstacle in his mouth, peering up at them from his vantage point several feet lower than the fox's back. Let the kids squabble, Kurama said. We must decide where to search first. Don't try to be the leader now when the whole thing is your own fault, Kurama, the two-tail huffed. Hey, Koseda said, springing up to land on the fox's snout in one large bound. There's no point in fighting now. We have to keep calm and decide where we're going to look first, or we'll never find Naruto-sensei. Well, where would you suggest, little nub? The four-tail demanded. Oh, well. Koseda scratched the back of his head and gave a nervous laugh. I've never actually been in this plane before, or actually really heard about it really, so I don't know. The Biju, and even some of his own teammates, stared at him for a moment before bursting out in sniggers. Oh, come on, don't be like that, Koseda huffed, crossing his arms over his chest. The kid has a point, the eight-tail said, settling down and looking around at his siblings. Where should we try first? The Nibai thought for a moment and offered. I'll go to the Volcano Valley, and you all go wherever you think a phoenix might hide, and the first one back with Big Brother gets bragging rights for eternity. Sounds fair, the Haichibi agreed. The three-tail looked between them for a long moment before shuffling over to stand beside the two-tail. The others followed this precedent, splitting into groups to take their own paths. Except for the six-tail who huffed in despair at the lot of them, turned her back, and marched off to the influflux plane, the obvious spot for the spirit who had grown bored of posing as a human god. At last it was just the nine-tail, the eight-tail, and the one-tail alone to set off on their journey to reclaim their lost brother, and the 7 humans commonary Biju they had dragged along for the trip. Where is that Jinchuriki of yours anyway? Kurama asked the Hachibi. The eight-tail shrugged. A rap concert. He's getting a surprisingly big following among the civilians. I don't know what a civilian is, the one-tail said, rifling through his bag for his spare jug of sake. Is it tasty? Kurama considered this for a moment. Not really. The best part is the texture, really. The one-tail hummed thoughtfully. I'm going to pretend I didn't just hear that, Yahiko decided. Hear what? Takashi asked, looking up at him. Yahiko glanced around to look at the other genin, saw the puzzled expressions on the duckies' faces, the horrified ones on his teammates' faces, and realized that suppressing memories really was a viable strategy to maintain at least a functional kind of sanity long-term. At least he was figuring it out early. He wasn't even 14 yet. Can we get moving now? Megumi said, securing the last of her supplies. Naruto-sensei is waiting for us. Does anyone know what it's like to be possessed by a phoenix? Koseda asked as they started in the direction the eight-tail led. Is it painful? Is it scary? Is he just sleeping? I bet he's fighting, Takashi said loyally. Whatever's happening, he's fighting to get back to us. Let's be serious, Kaoru said. Naruto-sensei probably hasn't even noticed yet. Megumi looked like she was going to argue for a second, then gave in with a shrug. That, or he's dreaming about ramen. The duckies would be surprised to learn that, in a manner of speaking, they were all right. Elsewhere and elsewhen, and, metaphysically speaking, in a small, quaint tea room with a lot of unnecessary porcelain, Naruto was trying his hand at that most mystical of all shinobi arts, diplomacy. But seriously, what do you want? Naruto asked, a delicate teacup balanced precariously in his hand. He shifted uncomfortably, but squelching against the soggy ground, and wished solemnly for ramen. His companions' butts didn't squelch, but he couldn't seem to find the trick to it. Naruto, sitting to Naruto's right, gave him a flat look out of pitch-black eyes. Naruto reined in the impulse to stick his tongue out at himself, but only barely. Sitting Saiza across the finely crafted mental construct of a table, Roki looked up from his contemplation of the mental constructs of small, colorful sweets in the center of the table. Want? The other identical copy of Naruto asked in surprise. I don't want anything I don't already have. My life is literally blessed. And that was before the opposable thumbs. He smiled, then paused and tapped his chin in thought. I guess if I want anything, it's to thank that big lug of a kitsune for the gift. I mean, he gestured at his form in demonstration. Such a fine gift almost makes me want to accept his suit. It wasn't a gift for you, Naruto said darkly. Naruto cleared his throat pointedly and said suit. For my hand. Roki settled back on his ankles and looked at his companion. I mean, I'm not going to. Have you seen that brute? But still. Hey, Naruto snapped, spilling mental tea all over his hand. Don't talk about Kurama like that. He's a great guy. Roki cocked his head. You really think so? I mean, it was a very thoughtful gift. And now I'm setting up the QB with the guy wearing my body, Naruto said to himself before turning back to the tea and sighing heavily. He glanced around the sewer his inner world was made of. A concerted effort had gone into cleaning the place up, but the little touches of home were mostly ruined by Naruto's implicit understanding that they were still, metaphysically speaking, sitting down to tea in his small intestine. You had to give the Phoenix points for trying, though. Listen, you can have the body for another week, Naruto negotiated. Then I need it back or you won't like what's going to happen. Are you threatening me? Roki asked, delighted at the prospect. No, Naruto said, slumping back into his seat. Maybe, Naruto, black-eyed and surly, said, shrugging. I'm just telling it like it is, Naruto said louder. With that, the two Narutos and one Naruto impersonator went back to their tea. With a thought, one of the blondes looked down, noticed his teacup was now larger and filled with pork ramen, or possibly always had been, and went back to eating without bothering to comment. It's not going to work out like you want it to, Naruto said, black shadow eyes half-lidded and chin balanced on his fist. When Naruto gave him a look, he rolled his eyes. Please, he doesn't want the body. He's lonely. I of all people know that look. He's aching for a friend and thinks wandering around randomly challenging people to dumb games is the way to get one. Naruto turned to Naruto and frowned. That wasn't nice. Naruto snorted and took a loud gulp of tea, and Naruto huffed and went back to his ramen. Roki blinked at the byplay and decided not to question it. But there was one thing. I know it's unforgivably rude of me, Roki began, not letting that stop him in the slightest. And it's not that I've spent extensive time in a mortal's psyche before, but… The phoenix cocked his head to the side and studied the pair for a long moment. Tell me, are there generally more than one of you in here? The Narutos blinked and looked at each other before looking back at their guest. Naruto shrugged. He's Dark Me. He's always been here. I just didn't always pay enough attention to him. Ah, Roki said, feeling enlightened. So, you are Dark Naruto, and you are Light Naruto. The Narutos snorted. No, Naruto waved the idea off. He's Dark Me, and I'm Mimi. Roki spent a moment trying to formulate a response to this, but before he could quite manage it, Naruto bounced in his seat and said, Hey, I had an idea. I'm friendly. Friend-like, I mean. Roki grinned, charmed. Yes. You can be my friend and stay in here and give my body back now, he said, the problem already solved in his mind. That's very nice of you to offer, Roki said in surprise, but it wouldn't work. Dark Naruto huffed. Isn't it crowded enough in here as it is? The more the merrier, Naruto said obstinately. You say that, Dark Naruto said sagely, because you weren't around while Mom and Dad's chakra got it on in the back tunnels. Naruto choked on his broth. Incident 9. Dear siblings, the letter began. I hope this finds you in good health. I am writing at the behest of Konoha's Hokage, who thought I should inform you of my plans to travel into another dimension for an unknown length of time before I run off, leaving my loyal subjects to believe I have been abducted and start a war. Yes, I think it is a very fine idea that I write this letter, thus preserving international relations and preventing that pretty, pink-haired Jounin from having a nervous breakdown. I am very considerate and conscious and would never dream of. No, that was all wrong. Sakura sighed tiredly. She had spent the better part of 3 hours dictating letters for Suna's council, by which was meant she spent 3 hours rewording the same letter with various levels of rage, while desperately trying to impersonate the Kazekage. If he hadn't wanted to be impersonated, he shouldn't have been inconsiderate enough to skive off to the spirit realm without bothering to tell his subjects that Konoha hadn't kidnapped him. Sakura's real trouble was that she doubted Gaara had ever written a missive in his life. Call it a hunch, but the young Kazekage just didn't give off a got my paperwork in order vibe. And Sakura would know. Sakura had a private army hidden within the village walls made entirely out of clerical nin who worshipped her as a guardian spirit. And that wasn't even to mention the Mednin who saw her as a minor god. But that was neither here nor there. So after hours of a steadily worsening headache and zero luck with the wording, she decided on a straightforward missive explaining everything. Sending a note explaining that their head of state hadn't been kidnapped usually wouldn't do much good, but Suna had been Konoha's closest ally for years. Plus, they had met Naruto and Gaara. Suna would get it. Dear Temari and Kankuro, Sakura's mind flew to the possible consequences of pissing Kankuro off by mentioning him second and started over. Dear Kankuro and Temari, Sakura froze as she visualized the even worse results of insulting Temari and quickly switched to Dear Siblings of the Kazekage. Too formal, Dear Gaara's sibling. Too familiar, Dear Kazekage sibling Sin. Perfect. One line down already, this was going great. After several more hours, she finally felt satisfied with her work. With a deep sigh, Sakura leaned back and said, Okay, I think that's about right. Did you get all that, Food-san? Food-san stared myopically down at the scroll she had been scribbling the missive down on. Sakura would be concerned, but the elderly clerical nin had been blinking at the bright light that could be found outside the deep-ceiling libraries since she had wandered into Sakura's office to act as her scribe. I think I've got it, Haruno-chan. Sakura twitched, but held the comment back between her teeth. Sakura would normally never allow a stranger to call her Haruno-chan anymore, but Food-san looked old enough to be her grandmother's grandmother, and that won her some freedom. If Sakura were a civilian, that would be because civilians believed elders should be respected because they were elders, which seemed like lazy, circular reasoning to Sakura's shinobi mind. But Sakura was a shinobi, and elders were to be respected because they had lived to old age, which was completely logically sound. For a shinobi to live long enough to become an elder, they had to be very dangerous. Looking at Food-san, with her oversized glasses, messy white hair pinned in place by used ink brushes, and ponderous expression, Sakura had no idea how or why the woman had lived so long, which just made her survival to advanced age even more alarming. So Sakura would stay polite. Meanwhile, in the Hokage Tower's inner chambers, the War Council was still hung up on basic questions. Questions like, how did one go about fighting a samurai? Could those weird sword-wielding guys even use jutsu? And the ever-popular, why are we at war again? But what I don't get, Kakashi said, is if the Phoenix possessed Naruto, why didn't it just go right back to Iron Country? He looked around the room to see if anyone else might have an idea. Tsunade stood to her feet and slammed her palms on her desk. Those bastards. The nobles of Iron Country staged this whole thing, and stop trying to make the war their fault, Hokage-sama, Shizune said, anger ticking at her brow. It's not going to work. Tsunade crossed her arms and huffed. I don't see why you're getting so upset over this, Shizune. The woman shook her head in disbelief. You declared war for no reason, Lady Tsunade. I think that deserves some censure. We actually had a chance for peace in our time, and we squandered it due to impatience and poor planning. Think of how your honored grandfather would feel. Tsunade snorted. Oh please, my little blunder has nothing on the other Hokage. At least we were already on the brink of conflict. All I did was declare war on the right village. What Tsunade was referencing was the little-known series of clerical errors precipitated by the offices of the first though third Hokage that had caused either minor miracles. The first Hokage's image being carved into the mountain instead of painted in a portrait that was meant to be commissioned, for instance, or major political fallout. An example? How about that the reason Mist and Rock were allies had nothing to do with anything the two villages may or may not have had in common? An alliance just turned out to be too much of a good thing to pass up when they always seemed to be warring on Konoha at the same time. But why did that keep happening? Because one of the secretaries who served the first three Hokage couldn't tell the two villages apart and kept sending declarations of war to one when the village meant to make war on the other. They then had to declare war on the right village, but the council was too embarrassed to take back the first declaration, thus creating a war on two fronts. It was the deepest, darkest secret of the Konoha Clerical Association. But an astute listener may ask, why and how was such an incompetent secretary allowed to remain in such a position for all those years? That was over a 50-year period, and the average lifespan for even a clerical shinobi was only 43 years. Well, the answers were simple and the same. Because Uzumaki Food was the only relative brought along with Uzumaki Mido when she married into the Senju clan and moved to Konoha, and Food was very, very good at what she did. Mind, that wasn't being a secretary. She was horrible at that. What she did do was create privacy seals so powerful their existence was still only a myth among other villages, and transportation seals so intuitive that they gave Tobarama the idea for the Harishin. She just couldn't be trusted to send a letter. And once the first few mistaken scrolls were sent, why, she was just shuffled out of the general secretarial pool and kept carefully sequestered away in the seal library, where any good Uzumaki was happiest anyway. Sure, every once in a while the woman would feel duty-bound to go looking for a standard clerical nin task to do, but as long as there was a clerical nin standing, she would be quietly redirected back to her comfy sealing desk. It wasn't hard to dissuade her. Food-san, a very good Uzumaki, and was so happy there that she hadn't even ventured out enough to figure out that her old village had been razed to the ground, and no one had the heart, or the lack of brains, to tell her. Oh, speaking of which, Tsunade said, snapping her fingers as a memory came to her, I got a few missives from the other villages yesterday. We have to send a liaison out to talk to all of the other Kage. What? Koharu asked, frowning. Why? Waving a dismissive hand, Tsunade said, Naruto got rather close with most of them during the war, so the letters were all about the same. Something about worrying over not getting one of Naruto's letters for a while, not trusting us to treat him fairly, and threatening us to produce him unharmed or feel their wrath. You know how it is. By the looks on the elders' faces, they did not know how it was. Sakura, though? She wasn't even there, and she knew. At about this time, Naruto's body was sitting in a tree, looking up at some crows on a higher branch and grumbling unhappily. Stupid, good-for-nothing rats of the sky. Gossiping hoodlums. He looked down at his feet, swinging in the wind. They wouldn't even talk to me, as if I'm not good enough for their conversations. He swallowed past the lump in his throat and looked down at his hands. What good are thumbs if I can't even fly? I thought ninja were supposed to be able to do amazing things. Oh, I can get all the way to the tippy top of a tree. Big deal. He sighed. This bites. He paused, shook his head, and leapt to the ground to land with barely a whisper of a breeze. On the other hand, thumbs. He bent down, swiped a pebble from the ground, and then, with a bare glance in their direction, flicked the pebble soaring towards the gossiping twits. He didn't hit any of them, but they scattered in all directions with indigent screeches to light their way. Roki snorted happily. There is that, though. With a laugh and a renewed lightness to his steps, he continued on his way down the path. What I don't understand, Naruto said from the back of his mind, is why you gave up so easy. You could have just asked them to play with you. Roki said, drawing himself up to Naruto's full height, am a guardian deity. I don't just go around begging crows to play with me. But Naruto could feel the nervous flutter in his own gut that meant Roki was just scared he'd be turned away. Let me do it next time, Naruto offered. I can show you how it's done. Besides the fact that I doubt you speak crow, Roki said, I already told you. I can't leave the body because you ingested me and my cells have become enmeshed in your cells. I've been fully incorporated into this body, and because I am divine, I cannot cede control of the body to you. Dark Naruto stirred in the depths of their mind. With a feeling like stretching out cramped limbs, he murmured, we're technically a semi-divine being. What are you talking about? Roki asked, stopping on the path. With a shrug, he let himself drop back into the blonde's inner world, leaving the body to stop and stare vacantly down the street. Several meters behind him, Thug-san and Thug-chan started a furiously whispered argument about what it was he found so interesting in the bushes. Azura's grandmother was a goddess, Dark Naruto explained to the Phoenix as he showed up at the sewer room table. At Naruto's obvious confusion, Dark Naruto huffed. Azura, your past life. Remember? I know that, but I don't know if that really counts, Naruto argued. That was Azura's bloodline, not mine. I mean, I'm my own descendant, a lot my own descendant, which doesn't get any less weird, but that was way back when. Literally over 1,000 years of new blood has been mixed in since then. What do you think a spirit is? Roki asked, sharing a long look with the dark version of his host. A soul? Naruto hazarded to guess. Exactly, Dark Naruto agreed. It has nothing to do with the flesh you're wearing, bonehead. You were born into the same family again and again, always a direct descendant, redoubling the blood each time. I can't be that godly, Naruto argued. Roki just said I can't take the body back because he's more divine than me. Yeah, he's a minor god, and you're still only semi-divine, the other agreed. But Kaguya was a pretty big-time goddess, and your messed-up psyche doesn't play fair, Dark Naruto explained. What are you talking about? There was an earth-shaking tremor throughout their inner world, as if something under the crust of the earth was rumbling in interest. Oh yeah, Naruto said, eyes wide. That guy. The curse of Kaguya was deeper and more vicious than it at first appeared, and not even intentionally on the goddess part. Kaguya was a deity, and godhood is more than blood deep. Her descendants were, if only in part god, semi-divine. Such a person could not be reborn into a purely mortal body. So all of her descendants could only be reborn back into Kaguya's own bloodline. This was the first part of Kaguya's twofold curse. The second part was knowing that. Sakura knew a lot of things she wished she didn't, partially because she was subjected to Tsunade on a daily basis, and partially because the second Hokage had known a lot of things and, through a cosmically hilarious series of coincidences and ancestral schadenfreude, Sakura had grown into remembering all of them. It was mostly his own fault though. Tobirama had been a genius. Worse, he had been curious. The second Hokage's most elaborate technique, Edo Tensei, was originally intended to reanimate the dead and bring back lost souls. It even worked, which was as impressive as it was terrifying. But even after such success, Tobirama never rested on his laurels. So when looking upon the jutsu that caused 1,000 holy men and 100 gods to stop and tremble in fear, instead of deciding he had gone far enough, he had a thought. What would happen if he attempted to bring back someone who had already been reincarnated? Would the new life end? Would the old life be reformed? Could he find a way to link each life back like a chain through the cycle of reincarnation? He wanted to know. And Tobirama himself seemed like a perfectly good test subject. He searched deep within himself using his new jutsu and looked for the answer of who he had been before his current life. And he remembered. This was the beginning of the worst of Kagaya's curse. Because it wasn't much of a curse until you considered that two of the main families of her blood had been at war for millennia. For some, the issue never got worse than a bit of awkwardness when they subconsciously realized they were their own grandmother or that the nephew they used to babysit was now their father-in-law. Those were the lucky ones. As in most things, Tobirama was not lucky in rebirth. The simple explanation was that his soul didn't seem to have a preference for which side of the clan divide it settled in. Add to that a time in the Uchiha Senju War that grew particularly vicious, and you have a recipe for disaster. Most of what Tobirama uncovered from his memory no jutsu were flashes of lives too quickly lived. In the first life he remembered, his name had been Uchiha Rei. Rei was murdered in cold blood at 2 years of age by a squad of Senju. In his next life, he was reborn as Senju Hitomi, firstborn of one of the clan's combat generals. Little Hitomi's last memory was sitting up in her crib as Uchiha Rei's father set upon her, knife raised, with tears on his face and hate in his eyes. The cycle continued like this for a time, longer than Tobirama was at all comfortable thinking about. A series of short lives cut shorter in vengeance for themselves. It left his eyes crossing to think about it. He did uncover memories of one life, where he was born into the Hyuga clan, lived a moderately productive life, and had 3 children with a loving wife. Tobirama decided that he liked the Hyuga clan right up until he remembered that he had died in that life by angering a clan elder and having his brain liquefied via caged bird seal. For the rest of his life, from the time he cast that jutsu to his death, Tobirama prayed every night to his ancestors, all of them, to be reborn into a civilian family. Any civilian family. But ancestor spirits were once people, and ninja have a sick sense of humor on the whole, and Tobirama could only be reborn as one of Kagaya's descendants anyway. That being said, even Tobirama's relatives knew the boy really had had terrible luck, and he had begged awfully politely, at least after the first few years when he got over that whole cursing jag. So the ancestors did their best. They found a small branch of the Uzumaki clan that had married into a merchant caravan and settled in Konoha. The Uzumaki-descended merchant family was only distantly related to Kagaya, but closely enough to count. Even the coloration had stayed true to their roots. Mostly. So at 4 years old, Sakura looked into a mirror and, without quite knowing why, thought to herself, "Pink hair, huh? So that's the way you want to play it." "Gaara's been abducted," Kankuro told Tamari, looking up from a letter clutched in his hands. I think that's what happened. That might be what happened. I would say an academy student is playing a prank, but this was written on official letterhead and delivered by the Hokage's own slug summons. So I think Gaara's been abducted, and whoever wrote this might be having a stroke. "What?" his sister said, looking up from her pile of paperwork to stare at her brother. "This is a letter from the office of the Hokage," Kankuro explained. "Except first it claims to be a letter from Gaara, then it goes into a rambling, vitriol-filled rant about people who don't finish their paperwork in a timely fashion and cause trouble for others, and then politely explains that Gaara went on a trip through dimensions and won't be back for a while. I don't know what to say. You read it." "Let me see that," Tamari said, ripping the paper out of his hands. She read for a long second before letting the tension seep out of her shoulders. "No, Gaara's just gone and done something dumb during a rescue mission." Kankuro raised a skeptical brow. "Are you sure about that?" "Yes," she said, then paused. "Let's go to Konoha, just in case. We'll bring a battalion or 2. Every few months Sasuke got sent out on a mission that he was entirely unsuited for, being neither within his security clearance nor the very narrow range of tasks he was temperamentally suited to complete. Tsunade argued the missions were arranged in an effort to get him to engage in village life, which Naruto bought hook, line, and sinker every time. This meant that he couldn't refuse without the dobe causing more of a fuss than Sasuke was willing or able to put up with. The truth, which everyone else knew thoroughly well, was that Tsunade wanted a break from Sasuke's unique mix of drama and emo sulking. Sasuke was not amused, but this one time he was almost grateful to be included. He wanted to help find the dobe too. So as he and Sakura headed out of the village gates with the diplomatic convoy, he tried not to cause trouble. He kept up the charitable mood all the way up to their actual arrival at their destination, when he realized that not only was this the single most boring mission he had been on since the end of the Fourth Shinobi War, but that his role was basically to stand around and look pretty and Uchiha at people. He hadn't been sent to Kumo to argue their case or act as one of Konoha's diplomats. He was Sakura's escort. Sasuke was playing the muscle. Sakura's muscle. It was a joke. Possibly, considering Tsunade was the one to send him, it was also an insult. He would get back at the hag later, but he was doing this for Naruto. If you asked him, Sasuke would place the blame for this whole thing squarely on Naruto. Sasuke had a bad habit of placing blame for things that irritated him squarely on Naruto, but in this one case, Sasuke was actually right. Because as Sakura stood before the Raikage and his brother and earnestly explained the whole sordid affair with the chicken dinner and the Biju invasion and the unnecessary dimensional travel, it occurred to Sasuke that only for the dobe would a ninja village have to go to its once enemies and explain how they had misplaced their own Kage candidate. This shouldn't have been the business of anyone outside Konoha. And yet, Naruto. And so it was. Also, he didn't want Sakura to murder him in his sleep. So Sasuke stood tall and mind-numbingly bored as Sakura tried to explain how all of this had happened without sparking off a war that they couldn't control. From his teammates' expression, it was both far easier. It was actually a fairly straightforward series of events, and far harder than it sounded. Though Sasuke couldn't quite decipher why that might be. Sakura's face had that mask-like quality it got when she was desperately suppressing the urge to throttle someone it would be political unwise to throttle. Sasuke couldn't say why though. Killer Bee had opened his mouth and said, "Yo-yo," and then some kind of blaring noise had washed over Sasuke's brain that he refused to interpret his speech. So Sasuke took that time to tune out the ongoing argument in front of him. He could look plenty pretty and Uchiha without trying, and turn back toward the wall in another attempt train his new eye to set flame to curtains by pure will the way his old one could. And in true Naruto fashion, random chance and sheer unpreparedness lead directly to success. But considering Sakura was also involved, unlucky Tobirama's reincarnation, the universe couldn't make it too easy. That was why as Sasuke stared blankly out the window down on the north-facing main market street of Kumo, he just noticed a bright blonde head of hair wandering down the street to the south.